Hello everyone, I hope that you're doing well, and I would like to welcome you to my top 7 creepypastas of 2021. I compiled these based on likes, viewer feedback, and one or two that I just liked, and so they're going to be in here. I recently just hit 2,000 subscribers. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but to me it is, and I'm very grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you to all of you who have liked and subscribed and shared and listened to my videos. I really appreciate it. I didn't expect to have people that would reach out to me and tell me that the narrations were such a joy for them. I mean, I've had a lot of people reach out to me and tell me that I suck, or they didn't care for it, or I needed to change this. You know, people are very critical in the world today. I had no idea. I kid. Most everyone have been kind, even when they have some criticism to offer, which I'm always open to. Well, I try to be open to it. Without further ado, let's get into it. The first narration in my top 7, which is in no particular order, comes from September of 2021. It's a cold story called Gullible. Ever since grade 3, my friends and I could make Derek Zimmer believe anything. Anything. From pop rocks and coke make your stomach explode, to earwigs actually burrow in your ears, and one's on your shoulder right now. Ha. To the typical local urban legend of the babysitter and the killer upstairs, and that it actually happened to someone in our neighborhood. The best prank we pulled on him had to be in grade 6, when we told him that everyone had to go into the girls' bathroom to change because a toilet had overflowed in the boys'. This was during gym class too, and in our school the bathrooms doubled as change rooms. Jeez, he didn't even question it. Didn't even wait to see us go in first. We followed right behind him carrying his spare set of clothes, a towel over his shoulder. We didn't even need to shove him in. He just walked through the door and we locked it behind him, and from then on there was nothing but hollering and shrieking from the other side. I got to admit, I still get tickled thinking about it. After grade 7, it stopped being funny, pulling fast ones on him all the time. But like a bad habit, we kept feeding him lies and watching him fall for them over and over again. I guess it didn't help that he had sheltering, hovercraft parents. I mean, the guy believed in Santa Claus until he was 13, for God's sake. And they kept walking him to school even though he lived literally just up the street. It wasn't until Derek begged them, after being tortured by our sneers and jeers, that they finally stopped. You'd think that they'd have tried to protect him by teaching him not to believe everything he was told. But I guess since they did everything for him, he just always needed someone else to make up his mind. I don't want you to get the impression that Derek was slow or something. He was actually a pretty bright kid. He wasn't top of the class or anything, and his math and science marks were pathetically low. But if you spent time with him, you'd see he was actually pretty insightful, especially when it came to abstract stuff like morality and friendship and artsy stuff. Oh yeah, I was friends with Derek, even though I constantly tricked and made fun of him. Yeah, I was one of those friends. He would actually analyze our favorite TV shows, comparing the ones he liked and the ones he didn't, and go into really meticulous detail about why some were good and some were bad, what made a joke funny and what didn't. At the time, even though I liked talking with him, I kind of thought that all this information was pretty useless. I mean, I just watched shows, movies, and played video games for fun, not to write a dissertation. If Derek had any brains, I thought, he'd put more of his energy into his schoolwork. But now, looking back, it makes me wish our school had a philosophy class or even an arts program. I think he would have excelled, rather than constantly being stuck getting C's and D's. But we grew up in a small frozen town in northern Ontario that only offered the bare necessities for a diploma. And in a town where most people work in the mines and spend their spare time ice fishing or playing hockey, Derek stuck out like a sore thumb. All the teachers seemed to like him, but you could tell they were pretty frustrated by how difficult he found the material. He was also a bit stubborn at times. For instance, you'd think he would have done well in English, right? Wrong. He shined only in the creative writing assignments, but didn't follow instructions and would never read the books that were assigned. The funny thing was, he was a voracious reader, always reading something. He just didn't want to be bothered reading Lord of the Flies or Of Mice and Men. He just thought they were a waste of his time. One thing that Derek excelled at, besides being a very loyal, to a fault, friend, was he was an amazing storyteller. When he got hold of an urban legend, or a dirty joke, or if something happened to him, he would tell it in such a way that we would hang on every word he said. There was no rambling, no ums or uhs. He always took his time and told the story perfectly. The punchline or the ending of his story was always clear and left us howling with laughter, terrified or desperate to hear more. More than a few of the stories Derek told us were uncannily frightening. Tales of ghosts and creatures in our hometown. Most of them I could trace back to some origin, usually Alvin Schwartz's scary stories to tell in the dark. But there were also a few I had never heard of and could not find a source for. Whenever I confronted him with this, he would give me this knowing smile, his light eyes at ease, and say, "There are some things that can't be explained." He would then pontificate about the other world and how everyone was able to access it if they just suspended their prejudices and disbelief. That was how he got beamed his stories, he had said. At the time, I thought it was bullcrap. This was the only thing I had ever known Derek to lie about. Now looking back, I wish I'd realized that this honest, gullible boy was incapable of telling falsehoods, and that what he was telling me was something he, at least, believed to be true. Eventually, I got a bit jealous of Derek. I never had a good memory for details, aside from numbers and figures. And often, when I told a joke, I'd forget an important part of the setup and the punchline would fall flat. Or if I told an anecdote about something that happened to me that I thought was funny or exciting, after I'd finish, the listeners would just stare blankly, their vacant faces tacitly screaming, "That's it?" I was also jealous of Derek because of the attention he got from girls. Although he wasn't very athletic, he was tall, fit, and good-looking. And his gullible nature, I think, made a lot of them think he was cute. You know, like a lost puppy you just want to take care of. Unfortunately for them, Derek was too absorbed in his own world of Marvel comic books, Stephen King, Family Guy, and Doctor Who to ever take a hint. This got really interesting in 10th grade when Christy Blackwell, a preppy girl from the States, came to our town. Her family was from Montana, and her father had come here for some administrative job at the local mining company. We didn't know it at the time, but his position and his family's move were only temporary. Now, we had likely nothing in common with this girl, but both Derek and I were absolutely smitten. When you're in a small town, all the kids date each other's sisters and exes. So I guess everyone was pretty intrigued by this new pretty face from somewhere exotic, like Montana. For a few weeks, she was all Derek and I could talk about. Some of our other friends thought she was cute too, but Derek and I were head over heels. I, however, never got up the courage to speak with her. I might have been top of my class and on the lacrosse team, but I knew what I was in the eyes of girls. A short, fat, sarcastic little boy with a sour disposition. Derek, however, he didn't have the same cowardice I had. He actually went up to her during lunch break and talked with her. I watched him approach, grinning from ear to ear, waiting for the humiliation and the peal of shrieking laughter from the other girls. But she actually talked with him. She was positively radiant when he introduced himself, and I thought I was going to have a heart attack when she invited him to sit down at her table. I admit, I was enraged. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. For some idiot like Derek with no prospects for the future to have that girl. And what would that mean for me? Why would he want to hang around some loser when he had that girl on his arm? Luckily, Derek, as I've said, didn't take hints easily, so it wasn't until a rumor had started about her liking him that he finally was ready to ask her out. Of course, he told me first. "Jimmy!" he screamed over the phone one night. I remember I actually winced from the receiver. "Guess what?" His voice blared at arm's length. After placing the phone back to my ear, I asked him, and he told me that he had heard it from one of the girls that Christy liked him. I felt a stone form in the pit of my stomach. Don't get me wrong, I knew that I wouldn't have gotten Christy. I just thought neither of us would, so the fact that he got her and I hadn't really burned my ass. But then I got an idea. An idea that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "Derek," I said into the phone, "she doesn't actually like you. I overheard her and Jennifer," the girl who told him. "They're just playing a trick on you." There was silence on the other end. Derek mumbled out a pitiful, "But," and I knew I had to pounce. "Listen," I implored, "if you ask Christy out on a date, everyone will just laugh at you. They're just doing this to make a fool out of you in front of everyone." Again, silence fell on the other end. I could then visualize Derek with his head hanging low, all mopey like he got sometimes. Then I took it a bit further. Over the line. I mean, come on, think about it. You and her? She's only been in our school 3 weeks, and she's already top of the class. Everyone turns their head to see her. How are you going to be good enough for that? I felt that stone in the pit of my stomach again, but this time for a different reason. After hearing Derek sadly mumble, "You're right," over the phone. Shamelessly, I changed the subject, asking him if we were going to still hang out this weekend to play Xbox at his house, but his voice never came back to normal. That night, I barely slept. I really felt like shit. This was the first trick I pulled on Derek that made me feel that way. But it wouldn't be the last. It was 11th grade. Lloyd, our other friend, and I took the pranks too far. Lloyd and I had just gotten back our exam results for 11th grade physics, and while we didn't fail, these marks weren't going to look good on a university application either. Of course, old Derek wasn't in physics, or chemistry, or biology. He found some loophole in a technicality to take something called Earth and Space Science in 12th grade for his science technology credit. Don't ask me how the Ontario education system works. Also, around this time, Derek was getting super obsessed with comic books and writing his own. Report cards and post-secondary prospects be damned. At the time, we thought it was really funny. He didn't just draw the 6 boxes with stick figures in them and the poorly graphed word bubbles like most kids. He actually found out the proper format to write a comic book script. He kept trying to make us read them, but, we didn't know how. Plus, we were busy, with school. Anyway, Derek had this long bastard of a comic book script freshly printed from the school library. An adaptation of some classic horror story by Poe or Lovecraft, I think. And he ran up to Lloyd and me in the cafeteria, all smiling, waving it at us, begging us to read it. And remember, this was the same day we got our abysmal test scores back. Now, despite our understandably pissy mood, both Lloyd and I resisted the urge to tear Derek's head off. Lloyd said weakly, "Sure, Derek, give it here. I'll read it tonight." Derek almost leapt off the table bench. He was so excited. He thanked us and then was off to God knows where. I turned my head and glared at Lloyd. "Are you serious?" I asked him. "You realize we have presentation for chemistry to finish tonight, right?" Lloyd blew out the side of his mouth. "I'm not going to read it, dude," he said, his eyes cast woefully down on the crumb and grease-laden tabletop. "I'm just pranking him," he concluded, quarter-heartedly. I sat there and stared at it for a few seconds. Then another malicious scheme started spinning in my head. I knew that my Uncle Eric was coming over for supper that weekend. I told Lloyd that we would both tell Derek that my uncle worked for Marvel Comics, and that he had read his script and loved it, and that he was interested in publishing it and giving Derek a job writing for Stan Lee. I'd invite Derek over to speak with him to discuss this job prospect at greater length. The funny thing was, my Uncle Eric was a belligerent drunk who'd mostly been unemployed between his time as a trucker and his time as a garbage man. But never, it probably doesn't need to be said, did he ever work for Marvel Comics. Lloyd and I both grinned and giggled like evil children. It was perfect. This way we wouldn't have to be drilled by Derek's questions about what our favorite part was, and he would be too preoccupied by the idea of having his work actually published. Working for Marvel Comics, for God's sake. I guess you can probably figure out what happened next. I'll try to spare you the cringe-worthy details as best I can. The next morning, Lloyd and I told Derek about my uncle and fed him our line. Derek beamed like I'd never seen before and bought it hook, line, and sinker. Of course. That Sunday, he came over for dinner, all excited. Of course. My Uncle Eric was 2 sheets to the wind, 6 gin and tonics deep, and on his 7th that night. Of course. And when Derek approached him, asking about his script and what it's like to work for Marvel, my Uncle Eric harshly barked what in the hell he was blathering about. Of course. I promised Lloyd I would give him all the details on Monday, but seeing Derek hunched over and defeated like some withered daffodil, I just had to look away. I didn't laugh, didn't chuckle, didn't even smirk. All I could do was look away, that pit in my stomach turning to stone. On Monday, in front of the school entrance, about 30 minutes before first bell and 30 degrees below zero, Derek stormed right up to me. Indifferent, seeing this coming and finding no despair, surprise, or pleasure in it, I stood where I was and let him hammer me. Instead, there were no threats, no curses, no accusations. Just one question. Did I lie about Christy Blackwell, too? Despite being exhausted from the endless stream of assignments and last night's interminable guilt, I somehow managed the strength to slowly shake my head and mutter, "No." One last prank on Derek. With that, Derek said nothing, and simply walked away. At that moment, standing there alone with sticky icicles running down my upper lip from my nose to my scarf, I thought I was going to throw up. The next day, I advised Lloyd we give Derek some distance at lunch hour. I suspected we were persona non grata. But, to my surprise, Derek came over to our table. Stone-faced, without a word, he sat down and ate. Lloyd and I glanced over at him, then at each other. The three of us just sat and chewed in silence. Then, after finishing his serving of oily cafeteria French fries, he told us one of his typically great, terrifying stories. His last. "You guys ever hear about Melvin Axelrod?" he began, cryptically. Fake-sounding name, still a pretty good start. Lloyd and I both shook our heads, wordlessly. He was a student at our school, way back when it was run by the nuns. I later found out this part of the story was true. Our high school, Pendleton College, was once run by the local nunnery. But this was when it was still a residential school, with only poor, shipped-in native kids as its student body. He's actually the person I'm going to write my next comic script on. I know you two won't read it, but I think you should hear about him anyway. Axelrod was a funny kid. A bit stupid, you know? Believed anything his pals told him. This, of course, immediately rang a bell for both of us. Lloyd and I looked at each other knowingly. Still, we were hooked. At least, I was. He was also very poor, with a sick father at home who couldn't work. So a lot of his friends could make him do things with the promise of money. So, one night, around this time of year, the dead of winter, all those years ago, Axelrod and his buddies went out onto Saul-Laskin Lake. It was frozen solid then, just like it is right now. Axelrod got dared by his buddies to walk out onto the lake, see if he could make it to the other side. Now, Axelrod was afraid, terrified, you know? Saul-Laskin is 2 football fields long and 3 fields wide. Sure, he knew it had been frozen solid for 3 months straight, and a jackhammer couldn't make a dent an inch deep in it. But still, he was unsure. He never walked across ice in the middle of winter before, never even put on a pair of skates. To his buddies, he shook his head no. He didn't care if it made him a chicken. He wasn't going out there, risking falling through. So, his friends decided to sweeten the deal. They told him that if he made it to the other side, they'd meet him there after walking along the shore and pay him $300. Now, his buddies didn't have $300, but they did have a thick wad of 10 $2 bills. So they slipped one into Axelrod's hand as proof there was more where that come from. They both figured it would be worth it to see Axelrod fall through the ice or wet himself from fear. Again, Axelrod wasn't too bright. He was also very poor, and his family was way behind on the electric bill, which was bad since this was one of the worst winters in Canadian history. So he took the $2 bill as proof they had 298 more, and made his way across the ice. The 2 of his friends giggled behind their frozen snot-covered mittens, egging him on, telling him he was doing great. Axelrod didn't clue in, though. He just kept going, waddling and swaying from side to side like a tightrope walker, terrified the rhino hide thick ice would give. Now, his 2 buddies didn't want Axelrod to get hurt, not seriously anyway. At most, they were waiting for him to slip and fall on his ass, so they could laugh at him until their bellies were sore. So, Axelrod got 60 feet across the ice when his buddies at the shore heard a sudden crunch, a sharp, unmistakable sound. The ice had cracked. Saul-Laskin was giving under Axelrod's weight. Apparently, the lake wasn't so titanium at the middle. Feeling a sudden rush of panic and just a bit of guilt, both of them started hollering at the top of their lungs for Axelrod to get off the ice, to turn back. Axelrod didn't turn around, though. He didn't even stop walking. He was determined to make it to the other side, to make that $300. Cracks in the ice be damned. His house needed heat. His pals on the shore watched in horror as Axelrod took 4 more steps before plummeting through on the 5th. Unable to think, being dumb kids, they freaked and ran away. It took them 10 minutes before they realized they needed to go get help. A couple of the nuns and one of the farmers from town came out onto the ice. When they got to the break where Axelrod had fallen in, they made a horrific discovery. On the other side of the hole was a set of freshly frozen footprints, like prints in the snow, but upside down and inside out. They were glistening and raised, like a trail of swollen scar tissue. And they headed to the other side, to the end of Saul-Laskin Lake. On the shoreline, the 5 of them ran to the other side of the pond, coming to the very end to find that the steps ended at a second gaping hole in the ice. Axelrod's body was never found, but the doctors were certain it should have been impossible for him to have walked that length of the ice without succumbing to hypothermia. Ever since that night, on the anniversary of Melvin Axelrod's Arctic plunge, they say he comes back, still drenched and half-frozen stiff, looking for the $300 promised him, and taking any unfortunate soul who dares wander across the ice, mistaking them for his two pals who had played that cruel joke on him so very long ago. Lloyd and I stared back at Derek speechless, our mouths agape. The silence was interrupted when two loud, chortling sophomores bumped into Derek from behind, making their way past him. "This has got to be bull," Lloyd insisted, rearing back from the table. "Where'd you get this?" I asked, my eyes having never left Derek's face. "I told you," he said. "It's the basis of my next comic script, which you won't read. There are some things out there that can't be understood, but you can find them out if you just suspend your disbelief." I looked hard at him. He smirked. "I heard it from one of the teachers and from one of the upperclassmen last year," he confessed. Both of them told the story exactly as I just did. I was then fairly certain what Derek was going to say next. And I was right. "The anniversary of Melvin Axelrod's disappearance is tonight," he whispered, as though we were sharing state-level secrets. "I say we go to Saul Laskin after dark and check it out." Lloyd blew out his mouth, his lips making that sound. "Yeah, all right," I said hastily, almost automatically. "What?" Lloyd blurted. "I'll go," I continued. "Hell, let's all go." "Great," said Derek, over Lloyd's grumbled protest. "Meet you both at the shoreline near 10th and Mockingbird. Be there at 10, sharp." With that, Derek stood from his seat, carrying his meal tray to the metal rack and exiting the caf. "Dude," Lloyd spun on me. "What gives?" "Look, man," I offered Lloyd, feebly. "We did a really lousy thing to Derek. I think the least we can do is spend one late night with him on this little whim." "That's crap," snapped Lloyd. "This is your way of playing another prank on him." I shook my head vigorously, vexed by this charge. "No way." "Yeah, well maybe this is Derek's way of getting us back. Playing a prank on us. You ever think of that?" "I doubt it. Derek's not like that." Lloyd just shook his head, obviously pissed. We didn't say anything after that, but we both knew we were going to Saul Laskin Lake that evening to meet Derek. I remember it was 10 below zero. Felt like -20 with the wind, and even worse that close to the ice. The stars were probably out, fully visible, but I don't remember seeing them. I could barely see what was in front of me from my face being 2/3 buried behind my scarf and toque. I met Lloyd on the way there, about 10 yards from the shoreline on Mockingbird, and he was likewise dressed like a winter mummy. As we got closer, we saw a figure standing upright, unfazed by the cutting gale. It was Derek. He was in his snow pants and a parka, but wasn't wearing anything to cover his head. Just a pair of earmuffs. Bizarrely, he seemed completely comfortable out here, his flushed red cheeks the only thing betraying how cold he was. "Well, here we are," he greeted us cryptically, a just as cryptic smile on his chapped purple lips. "What are we doing out here?" Lloyd growled, rubbing his thickly gloved hands together and bouncing from one foot to the other. "It's freezing." "We're here to see if Melvin Axelrod's ghost shows up," I told him. The look he gave me could have thawed Saul Laskin Lake that night. "I never said it was a ghost," said Derek, just over the wind. The two of us stared at our guide into the other world. "Then what is it?" I asked. "A zombie?" Lloyd mocked. Feigning ignorance, Derek just shrugged. The three of us just stood there, in the middle of January, in Canada, staring at a frozen lake like three wallflowers staring at a dance floor. An analogy that's not much of a stretch for us. Predictably, Derek broke the silence. "How about we play some truth or dare?" he asked. I looked over and saw that cryptic smile on his now bluish lips. "How about we play some go home and sleep in a house with central heating?" Lloyd barked. Me, I couldn't help myself. "Sure," I said, Let's play some truth or dare. You first, Derek pounced. Ordinarily, I would have bickered back and forth with Derek to try to get him to go first, but my recently grown conscience forced me to accept this condition. Okay, I said. I then looked out onto the ice, anticipating what the dare might be and not having any of it. Truth. For the first time that night, Derek's strange smirk disappeared. All right, he said, his face and voice now very serious. Yesterday morning. My mind then immediately raced to that moment, regretting my choice for truth. When I asked you about Christy Blackwell. Okay, never mind, I shouted over him, before he could even get the question out. I changed my mind. Dare. Give me a dare. What, you want me to walk across the lake? Is that it? Without speaking, Derek nodded his head, that cryptic little grin reappearing. I then looked back at the frozen lake. Derek hadn't lied when he said it was 2 football fields long. In fact, it was longer, 273.5 yards to be exact. From where we were standing, I could only see half of the ice, the other side swallowed up by night and fog. Okay, here's a deal, I said, trying to negotiate my way out of it. I'll go as far as when the fog starts. That's just before you two won't be able to see me. No deal, said Derek, his eyes colder than Saul Laskin. You go all the way across or until you see Melvin Axelrod, or you admit you believed my story enough that you're scared to go out there. What? Or choose truth. I'm not scared of that boogeyman crap, I exclaimed. Then why not go all the way, said Derek. You know that lake is perfectly safe for skating. It's been frozen solid since November. Because it's stupid, that's why. Or because you're afraid Melvin Axelrod will get you. No, I'm not. Fine. Then choose truth. Answer my question. Astonished, I shot him an incredulous look. Man, screw you, I cried. You're the one who's so stupid that you believe that dumb story. You probably did hear that story from an upperclassman last year. They knew you'd be gullible enough to buy it. I turned to the frozen pond, my eyes melting the ice. I'm going to go as far as that fog starts. From there, I'll be able to see over to the other side. I'll also be right in the middle, so it'll prove 2 things. 1, that no one could fall through the ice when it's this cold out. And 2, that there isn't some supernatural creature roaming around at night. I'll prove to you there's no such thing. Derek looked back at me. That strange smile disappeared again from his lips and never came back. I'm not gullible, he insisted in a low voice. The story is true. Ah, up yours, I said, walking to the edge of the shoreline and shuffling gingerly onto the ice. Come on, Lloyd, let's go. Me? I heard from behind. Come on, you wimp. Let's show this moron how stupid and full of shit he is. The 2 of us waddled onto Saul Laskin. We inched our way closer and closer to the foggy middle, the thick air never seeming to thin out and recede like it normally would. Truthfully, I could barely see an inch in front of me. The whipping cold air caused me to tear up and turn my tears to icicles on my lashes. But I was too angry to care. In my mind, I told myself I just wanted to prove to Derek what an idiot he was. In truth, I just wanted any way to avoid telling him the truth about Christy Blackwell. We were well past the center point when I finally decided to stop. Lloyd was a bit ahead of me. I looked around. The fog was so dense. Even worse, I had to blink my eyes rapidly to break up the frozen moisture that accumulated on my lashes. I roughly cleared my vision with my gloved thumb. And then I saw it. A hunched figure, just obscured by the fog, hobbling slowly toward Lloyd. Lloyd must have been having the same trouble I was, because he made no effort to run or communicate with the figure, even though it was practically right in his line of sight. At first, I thought it was Derek. Thought he had somehow caught up and was trying to scare us. But I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. I tried to warn Lloyd, to shout out, to ask who was there, but I couldn't. The words were trapped in my throat, and I was as petrified as the ice I stood on. I stared, seeing the nearly naked figure coming into focus. It was a man, or what was once a man. The skin was pale, translucent, all the blue and purple veins visible. The hair was blonde, silver, and slicked back, like the head had just been submerged in water. It looked like a cadaver that had escaped from the city morgue. Its bright-colored eyes resembled a pair of round, broken mirrors, and never once did I see them close. Not even blink. Then I heard it speak. "I did it," it muttered, hoarsely, the sound like the ruffling of crumpled paper. "I did it. Where is she?" The creature was mere feet from Lloyd, but he'd turned his back to it like it wasn't there. He then lifted his head, one red eye open, and asked me, "Jimmy, did you say—" Before he could finish, the walking cadaver shot a long, bony arm grasping his shoulder with its claw-like fingers. Lloyd looked around and shrieked. "Where is she?" The thing muttered huskily. "Where's my baby?" Undoubtedly, terrified, Lloyd tried to sprint away, only to slip and fall on the ice. The walking cadaver's grip remained unbroken, causing Lloyd's winter coat to rip. The thing pinned him onto the ice, its grasping claws shaking Lloyd by the lapels. "You said if I did it, you'd tell me where she was," it hissed into Lloyd's face. I watched, still petrified, only able to imagine the look of confusion and terror on Lloyd's bundled-up face. "Where is she?" the creature screamed. "Where is she? You promised! You promised!" Its voice cracked at the last syllable. It then started throwing Lloyd's torso up and down until the back of his head hit the ice with a shuddering thud. I cringed. It was like the sound of a bowling ball being dropped straight to the pine floor. The thing then mounted him, clawing and punching at his lifeless form in a hungry frenzy. With its cracked, blackened teeth bared, the canines resembled a set of fangs. I wanted to run, I wanted to help, to fight that thing off of my friend, but I swear, I couldn't. By the time that thing had stopped, I could see fleshly, fallen red droplets steaming on the ice around Lloyd's head. I knew then that he was gone. What happened next? I can't explain. The creature laid down on Lloyd's supine body, putting its pale, grotesquely scabbed head on his chest, as though listening for a heartbeat. I then realized that the fog was thickening. There were whole plumes of smoke wafting up from the ice beneath their bodies. I realized when they began to sink that the ice was melting. The creature sunk down beneath the ice, pulling my friend's corpse along with it. Once they had slipped out of sight, I heard the worst sound you could possibly imagine, the sound of the ice cracking. I looked at my feet, saw a deep gash, shaped like a lightning bolt, tearing a path through the ice beneath my feet and between my legs. Several mini fractures splintered off, creating a spiderweb of icy shards. My senses returning to me, I ran, falling and stumbling back to the shoreline. I don't know how many steps I made before I slid and fell through, and was completely submerged in Salt Alaskan. I don't remember how cold it was, though it was freezing beyond imagination. I just remember the disgusting feeling of my clothes soaking in the water beside my skin, and the sheer panic blaring inside my skull. Remember how I was short and fat? Well, I also didn't have a clue how to swim. I just floated there under the water, not seeing a damn thing, my mind a riot of horrible scenarios and images. As you would expect, I flailed in desperate mortal fear when I felt a hand grab at me and pull. Thankfully, the hand was pulling me upward to safety, and it belonged to Derek. "Jimmy," Derek panted, after he'd dragged me up onto the surface. It's okay," he struggled to say as he too was drenched in the icy water. "Here's my coat. Put it on." He then laid his open parka over my body. Luckily, he had taken it off before diving in to save me. I'm sure now if it wasn't for his quick thinking, I'd have died that night. Listen to me," he stammered on. His lips were turning a deep blue, as was his face. "My phone is in one of the coat pockets. Call 911. "What?" I said. not understanding why he didn't do it himself. "Just do it," he said, and turned and began walking in the direction of that creature. "Wait," I hollered. I'm going to get Lloyd," he blurted out. Now this is where I'd like to tell you that I forced Derek to stay with me, that I told him the truth about Christy Blackwell, that I apologized for the cruel joke I had played on him with Lloyd and my Uncle Eric, and for always taking him and his friendship for granted. But that didn't happen. Shivering from the cold and my own fear, I just watched as he marched away, disappearing into the fog. I took out his phone from the right pocket and dialed 911. I remember hearing the phone ring, the monotonous sound reverberating in my skull. I don't remember anyone answering. The last thing I remember is the feeling of my body growing warm, all the pain and fear evaporating with the fog. And then there was blackness. Blackness save for a kaleidoscope of horrible images playing on loop in my mind. I woke up in the emergency room. I was told that the paramedics and fire departments were called out, that they'd scanned the ice but never found Derek or Lloyd. I was told that I was lucky to be alive, even luckier that I didn't have frostbite and would therefore not have to lose any appendages. Eventually, they got around to asking me why we were out there and what happened. I told them everything, every last detail. Of course, they all looked at me like I was crazy. Some of them even thought that I might have gone into shock and asked my parents to have me undergo a CAT scan. I never did, though. During my time in the hospital, 3 thoughts kept spinning around my brain. 1, how grateful I was to Derek Zimmer for saving my life. 2, how amazed I was that his story was actually true. And 3, why that creature kept asking for its baby instead of for money, like Derek had said in his story. I found out later that the story Derek had told us that afternoon was one of many legends concerning Saul-Laskin Lake and that night. Some were about a man whose daughter had been kidnapped by a gang of thieves, that the man was thrown into the lake, his feet encased in concrete, after he'd paid their ransom. Some were of a mentally disturbed woman who had drowned her baby after thinking that the devil had taken possession of it. And at least half a dozen more I can't stomach reciting here. Perhaps the worst moment after that night was when I got a visit from Mrs. Calhoun, the principal at Pendleton College. She was in her early 70s, stout, with a tight silver bob cut and a pair of owlish spectacles on her round little nose. She sat down at my bedside, wearing her shapeless, ridiculously patterned muumuu, and asked me what had happened at Saul-Laskin. I told her the same story I had told everyone since waking up in the emergency room. When I was done, she just stared at me, expressionless, before giving out a sharp sigh through her tiny nostrils. "This is what I think happened, James," she began, a subtle disdain in her voice. "I think you dared Lloyd Apanowitz and Derek to walk out there on the ice. We all know how you tricked and tortured that poor boy since primary school. I think when the ice cracked and your friends fell in, you panicked and came up with this ludicrous lie to cover your tracks, because you think we're all as gullible as poor Derek Zimmer. Because you think you're that smart and the rest of us are that dumb. I think you're a cruel, immature, sociopathic little boy who will end up becoming a cheat and a fraud and spending his adult life in and out of prison." From my bed, I stared back at her wide-eyed. It was so surreal. An adult, a teacher, speaking to me in such a way. "And I don't care who you tell this to," she hissed, "because I'm retiring at the end of this school year. And if I never see another sadistic child like you again, it will be too soon." And when I brought up how I'd been rescued, had almost succumbed to hypothermia myself. She grunted and said, "I don't know. You seem all right to me. After all, you didn't even get frostbite out there, did you? And you're the only one of those boys who survived." She then shook her wrinkled gray head at me, making a noise with her tongue. "In and out of prison," she repeated to herself before rising from her chair and leaving me in my own. Today, I'm happy to tell you her prognosis was false. I haven't been in jail at any time in my life, and the worst I've ever gotten is a speeding ticket. That being said, guilt has followed me around ever since that night. I never told Derek that I had lied about Christy Blackwell, and for that, I am eternally sorry, as I am for making Lloyd come with me across the frozen lake. I had also doubted Derek about his story of the spirit that still haunts Saul Laskin once a year on a January night. For that, too, I am sorry. I don't know what compelled me to play so many tricks on him, besides my overly logical and cynical nature. But ever since that night, I'm not so quick to dismiss something, even if it does seem fantastic, or even impossible. So, Halloween was coming up last year, and I still hadn't picked a story that was Halloweeny. Yeah, Halloweeny. Yeah, that's a word. So I hopped on the old Reddit machine, looked around, and found this one, and it was well written, and I enjoyed it. The premise is kind of cool to me. And this story ended up being the fastest climbing story of anything I've ever uploaded. Here is the tale of Farmer Tom. Halloween was always a big deal in my small town. All through the month of October, Mayor Higgins would hold various events and attractions. Our town is so popular on Halloween that the mayor even had its official name changed to Hallows Crest. He was going to use Halloween Town, but obviously couldn't due to copyright reasons. Hallows Crest sounds better anyway. Everyone in town took it seriously too, and the spooky season everybody else talks about when they refer to October didn't exist for us. It's more like spooky year, but every year. Nobody, however, took it as serious as Farmer Tom. Thomas Maynard was your average Old MacDonald type of farmer, overalls and all. The man had acres upon acres of farmland, which he used to set up all sorts of attractions like corn mazes, pumpkin patches, haunted barn tours, and more. His most famous attractions, however, were his Halloween decorations. Nobody in your spiffy, privileged little cul-de-sac has decorations half as good as his. Tom took pride in his work. He would spend all year devising new works of devilry that scared the piss out of the people in town. In an old boring town, he might be considered weird or off in the head. Farmer Tom was the most popular person in town. All the townsfolk even donated to his cause as well. They would either donate or just straight up buy him supplies he needed to craft things and fill up their frightful little town as well as his farm. Now, when I tell you that his attractions looked real, I mean, this man knew how to craft. One year, he created this giant spider structure that was made primarily of wood, but the outside was completely covered in fur. Real fur from real animals. When asked about how he acquired the fur, He claimed that he had bought most of it and had it shipped here, and the rest of it he gathered from random roadkill. Nobody in town questioned him, because he had come from a wealthy family and decided to break away from the big cities where they lived and settled down in the country. I guess he found his perfect fit. He didn't need the town's donations to his cause, but he accepted them because they wanted to give back to him for all the spooky joy he spread throughout the years. Now, Tom would be gone for an entire 2 months of the year, every single year. All the townsfolk guessed that it was his well-deserved vacation, or that maybe he was going to see family. He would always leave around July and come back at the beginning of September. Over the entire month of September, he would be secretly preparing his decorations for the month of Halloween. His best and scariest decorations he ever made also doubled as a good resource to scare off crows, too. That's right, you guessed it. Scarecrows. His scarecrows weren't these puffy, fat wannabe straw men that had cute noses and a smile that you could just pick up at Walmart. His scarecrows were all different sizes, and he could position them in all kinds of ways. Some would stand, others would be performing some kind of action like raking a field or chopping a tree. Some would stand guard at the front of some of his attractions, and others would be in his fields, posted up like a normal scarecrow. Nobody messed with these things, mainly because they were creepy as hell, even for a town obsessed with Halloween, but also because it annoyed Tom. One year, a kid no older than 7 had started messing with the straw on one of the legs of the scarecrow. He had managed to tear off most of the hay straws on one leg before Tom discovered it. He shut the farm down to visitors after that for a whole 2 months. The parents of the kid apologized, and he accepted. Ever since then, no one, and I mean no one, screws with them. That was until the Carter family moved in. They needed some adjustments, but eventually, after a month or so, they became a part of the regular town and had gotten the hang of how things worked. That same year, around the end of August, Carter kid was hanging around his friends, and they mentioned about how Tom would be back soon to prepare his decorations. Now, most people know that kids can be a little rebellious, and sometimes nigh uncontrollable. But the kids in Hallows Crest knew the rules and followed them well. Tom gave them enough spooky rewards as it was, and knew that if they messed with him, that they would probably get banned from the farm, have their parents upset at them, and not get any of Tom's candied jerky when they trick-or-treated at his house. That last one was their favorite. The town's favorite food, actually. It tasted so good. Anyway, the Carter boy became curious as well as rebellious, and he didn't care about the consequences because he was new. He just didn't understand. He decided that he would sneak over to Tom's farm when he got back and see how he made those terrifying creations. He waited until Tom pulled into his driveway one day and followed him down to the woods. Tom had a place in the woods away from everyone else where he prepared. It was a large shack that held his supplies. His workshop, if you will. The Carter boy managed to not be seen by Tom and had ducked near a bush. He was just about to try and find a window to peer through when Tom walked out the front door, got in his blue pickup truck, and headed back to his farm. He must have forgot something because he was pissed off, huffing and puffing when he left. The boy peered out of the bush to check if the coast was clear, and he bolted to the front door of the shack once he seen the last bit of blue from the truck dash over the hill. In his fit of annoyance, Tom must have left the door unlocked, so the boy let himself in. The shack was large on the inside. He seen stacks of various wood and other materials nearby. Tom had bins of random clothes that he decorated his scarecrows with. Everything from kids' clothes to grown adults. There were also piles of fur and other animal parts like claws, hooves, beaks, and other things that wouldn't rot. In a room toward the back was 5 large deep freezers. In them was large containers of fake blood and animal parts. The boy was just about to leave in fear of Tom coming back when he heard strange moaning. It sounded like the type of moaning someone does when they're in pain or when someone just wakes up. But there were many moaning sounds coming from somewhere. He wasn't sure yet. The boy followed the moaning noises to a large rug in the center of the room with all the supplies in it. It was right below him now. The boy curiously moved the rug and found a large trapdoor. It wasn't locked. He either thought that Tom didn't need a reason to lock it, or that he never thought it would be found by anyone else. He slowly lifted it. There was a set of stairs under the door that led down another level into what looked like a dingy handmade basement. At the end of the stairs was a door that simply read, "Scarecrows." The boy opened the door slowly and hesitantly. What he saw was ungodly and disturbing beyond all measure. There were people, naked people, tied to posts, at least 20 or more, and they all had tubes inserted in their noses, feeding them. There were also IVs in their hands that connected them each to some kind of narcotic. They were alive, if you could call it that, and producing an eerie moan like they were in pain. Tom had only given them enough drugs to render them helpless, like zombies, so they were able to be in a state of hazy consciousness. The Carter boy ran out as fast as he could and bolted back into the town. Somehow, he made it back without alerting Tom to his presence. But he left the door to Tom's shack open when the town's police went reluctantly to investigate. There was no sign of Tom anywhere. He had fled. The officers investigated the shack and found the people in the basement and the freezers of real human and animal blood, as well as parts. They also discovered the clothes that he used to dress up the scarecrows, along with a small chest above the bin that the boy either couldn't see or reach. Inside the chest was countless IDs of the people he had kidnapped and killed. There were more than 200 IDs. Needless to say, our little town got a rebranding and decided that 1 month a year was good enough. But nobody, not even farmers, make scarecrows anymore. This next story is simple and straightforward. I really enjoyed doing it. It's a prison story, which I have a few of on my channel. It got quite a few views and a lot of likes, and so it made the top 7 creepypastas of 2021 for my channel. So here it is, A Prisoner I Will Never Forget. Disclaimer. Names and certain facts will be changed to protect the identities of the innocent involved in this story. To be completely honest, I became a corrections officer because I felt like I couldn't fit in anywhere else. Is that sad? Yes. Is it true? Well, when I made that decision, I truly felt that way. But after the story I'm going to tell you, I've decided to work harder to put myself in a better position in life. Anyways, this all happened last Monday, the only day of the week I worked overnight shifts. The entire prison was abuzz that day because just 8 hours earlier, a new prisoner was transferred there. Not just any prisoner, mind you, but a bona fide monster. Harrison Pelton was charged with 2 murders, though is suspected of nearly 25, 4 counts of kidnapping and torture, 8 counts of assaulting a police officer, and finally, a federal terrorism charge. By his mid-20s, Harrison had decided that his batshit insane ideas on how this universe works, with him at the center, literally, were sound enough to attract followers, and somehow he was correct. Over the next 15 years, Harrison and his group, they never officially named themselves, grew in numbers and bloodlust, striking out whenever people announced skepticism of Harrison's beliefs. This attitude boiled over in early 2019 when Harrison and his 14 followers kidnapped a professor and his 3 daughters, after the professor had made incendiary comments about a paper Harrison published the year prior. It still isn't known exactly what happened, but when the police raided the abandoned farmhouse the group were staying in, they discovered the hell that Harrison put his captives through. The professor had been completely skinned, and his skin had somehow been stretched enough that it covered a good bit of a horse's stall. The daughters had been brutally mutilated, 2 of which somehow had their organs surgically altered to cause them unending pain, and the other 2 had multiple appendages severed and were used for various vile acts. The police were finally able to locate the farmhouse in March of 2019, after one of the daughters' phones had accidentally been turned on, resulting in a ping from a nearby cell tower. When the first few officers attempted to make arrests, they were met with armed resistance. So, a couple hours later, 17 more and better armed officers arrived and engaged in a firefight with the group. One of the officers on scene had been deployed in Afghanistan before, and he remarked that this battle was worse than anything he had experienced over there. Off the record, he told a journalist,
"One thing you will never be told about are the things that don't make sense. Mainly after we had overpowered them and arrested the survivors, the amount of spent ammo found in that barn did not match the rate of fire they had been using beforehand. That's something I've never been able to shake from my mind."
The firefight lasted 45 minutes, wherein 1 police officer had died, 8 were seriously injured, and 9 cultists had died, with the rest being arrested after, strangely, laying down their weapons, admitting defeat. For some fucking reason, Harrison hadn't been put into a supermax initially. This led to him somehow convincing 5 other prisoners to attempt an escape at their prison this past February. They nearly made it, but were stopped at the literal last second. This forced officials to smarten up, and after a legal battle, fought with paperwork, they finally came to the conclusion that he would be transferred to a supermax just 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately for me, due to a mixture of a paperwork fuck-up with iffy COVID regulations, Harrison had to be vacated from his previous prison by the 1st, but he couldn't arrive at the supermax until the 3rd. So, being the closest prison to that supermax, my great warden said he would take Harrison for a few days until he could be fully transferred. According to co-workers I've spoken to, the entire day leading up to Harrison's arrival, staff and prisoners were talking about him. A good bit of the chatter was about Harrison's looks. The guy is nearing his 40s and still could pass for 18, and a reputation of being extremely uncooperative with pushy people, which could describe 90% of both prisoners and corrections officers. Harrison arrived at my prison around 3 p.m. that day. The prisoners had just had their lunch, and various groups were starting to have recreation. Again, due to wonderful COVID regulations, we could not put Harris into isolation due to shitty timing. We had a big fight a few days before, so most of the rooms had been filled. And others just had prisoners moved out. But there has to be a wait time before a new prisoner is moved in there now. So, he was moved to the community cell block where our riskiest prisoners are housed. Of course, my block. From what I've been told, things went smoothly for the first few hours. Harrison was constantly bombarded by prisoners in his room, asking all kinds of questions, and some possibly trying to provoke him, but he just sat there on his bunk, completely silent. The prisoners were disappointed by not being able to play with him, so when the on-duty officers yelled at the other prisoners to leave the cell, they did so without complaint. It wasn't until my shift began, 7:30 p.m., that things started to break down. It started with a little argument over dinner. The 3 occupants of the cell to the right of Harrison's felt as though somehow he had been given a larger portion of food than anyone else. They started shouting at us, claiming we were going to treat the celebrity better than them. Then, after we didn't give them the response they wanted, they began berating Harrison, calling him a creep, a freak, and that he wasn't tough, just sick. Now, I was never told what it was, but Harrison had yell-whispered an insult back to the 3 men, which caused them to jump from their table and storm Harrison's. Harrison jumped to his feet as well, and got in the faces of the other prisoners. I still remember the look of Harrison's eyes as he stared into theirs. He didn't really look angry. He looked hungry, like a predator that knew he had just caught some prey. Luckily for the officers on duty, the men never came to blows. After the stare down went on for a bit too long, both sides just decided to back off for some reason. The next 2 or so hours went all right. There were no more incidents, and the prisoners quietly went to their rooms at 9 for lights out. I was charged with direct observation from an upstairs room that night. About 20 minutes after the men went to bed, the overall block lights turned on, and then off, and then continued to do this in rapid succession for about 20 more seconds before stopping and leaving the lights on. I radioed down to an officer, asked them what was going on with the lights. According to the guys downstairs, nobody had been in eyeshot of the light switch for the past few minutes, but they did confirm that someone had switched the block lights on. About 40 minutes later, I began to feel strange. Even though nothing had really changed, I was suddenly filled with extreme anxiety. So much so that I continuously squirmed in my chair and kept looking around the room. It felt like I was being watched by some man-eating beast. Unfortunately, this feeling was a bit vindicated after my 4th look around, when I saw something awful in the door's window. Standing on the other side of the only door to the observation room was what I could only describe as a misshapen face. Grayed skin, a right eye that sat nearly half an inch lower than the left, a bulbous chin, and a nose that almost perfectly resembled a pig's snout. Obviously, I have never seen this face before, so, with that classic fear hesitation coursing through my veins, I struggled to get out of my chair and move slowly toward the door. About halfway there, the face disappeared from the window. And when this happened, felt like a light had been switched. Feeling strangely empowered, I sprinted out of the room's door and looked around. Unfortunately for me, there was nobody in the hallway where the room's door was located in, so I sprinted toward the hallway connected to the left. Now, I swear, I was only gone for about a minute and a half, so you can imagine the jump scare I got when I arrived at the second hallway, only to be met with a chorus of blood-curdling screams. I twisted around as fast as I could, trying to figure out where the screams were coming from, and when I realized that they were actually coming from inside the block, I ran back to my observation room, slammed down the alarm button, and headed back out so I could get into the block. The screams stopped as I sprinted down the stairs. Luckily, my fellow officers were quick, so a couple already had shields by the time I got to the block's entrance. We entered a few moments later, screaming at the prisoners to wake up, get on their cell's floor. One of the other officers demanded to know where the screaming was coming from. "Officer, I believe that was my neighbors," a voice I had heard on the news crooned. The cell to the left of Harrison screamed that it wasn't them. So the other officers and I ran to the one on the right. Even though it has been over a week since, I can still smell the copper coating the inside of my nose. I wasn't at the front of the line, so my heart jumped as I heard one of the officers scream and frantically tried to get the cell door open. Inside was what I can only describe as meat. There wasn't a single identifying feature inside that room. The floor, walls, and the ceiling were coated in blood, organs, and meat. Investigators allowed me to leave the prison once I had given my statement, and I don't intend on going back. I did get in contact with one of the two officers that were declared mentally competent to remain on the job, though. According to them, Harrison was forced into solitary, against codes, on a blanket accusation of unruliness. According to the officers who moved him, he couldn't stop smiling. As for the dead prisoners, the investigation was handed to an unnamed authority. Thankfully, Harrison was moved to a supermax prison, where he will remain for the rest of his life. And as for me, I don't intend on taking another step inside a prison. All right. This story is probably one of my favorites. No, this story is my favorite so far that I've done. It just has a feel to it that spoke to me when I read it, and I was grateful to the author, 20,000 Bears, for allowing me to read it. Honestly, I would love to have this one back to redo. I've gotten a little better at sound design, and I hear it and I just hear the mistakes that I made. But it's still a pretty story, a little creepy, a little sad, and this is called The Girl from Blackbird Creek. I didn't see her at first. Too wrapped up in my sketchbook and the beginnings of a caterpillar doodled carefully on the page to notice. I could spend hours out alone under the tree canopy with a pencil in one hand and a jam sandwich in the other, drawing bugs and birds and plants until my hand cramped and my eyes blurred. The woods were my happy place, my safe place. Sometimes I'd even talk to the old oaks and aspens, and sometimes they'd talk back. In their own way, of course, swaying and creaking in the breeze. Summer was my favorite time, and even this year's constant rain couldn't dampen my spirits.
What are you doing?
Her voice was smooth, like honey, warm and sweet, and from the second my muddy brown eyes met her mossy greens, I was a goner. I think she knew it then, too, mouth pulling up at the corners in amusement. I watched her gaze fall to the little leather-bound book in front of me.
Did you draw that?
She asked, and I nodded. The smile never left her face as she made her way across the clearing, coming to sit opposite me on the fallen tree trunk. An uprooted oak pulled from the ground during the floods last year, felled far too prematurely.
It's very good.
My cheeks felt hot. Are you new to town? I managed to choke out, silently thanking whatever god might be listening that my voice didn't crack.
Yes.
She frowned, the gesture looking very unnatural on her gentle features.
We just moved here, my mother and I. We live down there.
She pointed a delicate finger down the hill towards the town limits, towards Blackbird Creek, towards the place we were always warned never to go. Oh, was all I managed to say. Everyone from town knew the tales of Blackbird Creek. We grew up with them, the stories of swamp witches and creatures of dark magic that lived by the murky waters, beings that waited hidden in the tree line, ready to catch you or curse you or worse. She didn't look like a swamp witch, though. She looked like an angel. We spent the rest of our time together in silence that afternoon, her watching carefully as I added each individual prickly hair to the spine of my caterpillar, while I quietly tried to control my racing heart. When it came time to say goodbye, she frowned, that same unnatural-looking frown.
Will you be back?
Yeah, I come here almost every day, I said, and with that, her features eased again.
Good.
She said with a nod, and turned to leave before looking over her shoulder.
I'm Elizabeth, by the way, but everyone calls me Lizzie.
Caleb, I said, and she gave one last flash of her dazzling white teeth before disappearing between the alder trees. It was almost supper by the time I made it back to the house. I slid my boots off quietly by the door before stepping inside, hoping that I'd be able to sneak through the hall and up the stairs without Father hearing. "That you, boy?" he called from the kitchen, and I shuddered to myself. "Yes, sir." I found him sitting at the dining table, pipe in hand as usual. "Where you been?" His muddy eyes, the same shallow brown as my own, stared me down suspiciously. My stomach nodded. "Nowhere. Just out," I lied. He scoffed. "There's stew in the pot." He pointed the long end of his pipe towards the stove. I portioned some into 2 large bowls and took the seat opposite him, holding my hands out automatically. He took hold and gripped hard, his leathery calluses rubbing against my knuckles. "Dear Lord, we pray that you keep watch over our souls in these the darkest of nights, for black shadows creep unseen to try and claim that which we devote to you. Amen." We ate quietly together, our usual routine since Mother died. She passed the day the floods began last year, and since then the house felt dull and lifeless. Father was never much of a talker before that, but tonight he seemed much heavier in thought than usual. his thick black brows knitted together underneath the deep-set wrinkles that decorated his forehead. "Lads at work were talking. Said something about a family living down at Blackbird." He paused on the name, as if the very syllables left a bitter taste in his mouth. "A load of old horse shit, if you ask me, but you better stay out of them woods. You hear me, boy?" "Yes, sir." I nodded firmly. "Good." The house was empty when I woke. Father always left for work before the sun rose, so I took my time getting ready, carefully wrapping an extra sandwich in parchment, just in case, before I made my way to the woods. I stepped into the familiar clearing and breathed in deep, the smell of wet earth and damp wood filling my lungs. I was alone, a fact I'd usually have reveled in, but today was different. Perhaps she'd changed her mind about seeing me again. Perhaps she'd realized how enamored I'd been on our first meeting and thought I was strange. I knew I wasn't much to look at, a little too short for my age, and a little too round in the middle, a troll next to her. Maybe that's why she wasn't here. I silently chastised myself for thinking she'd come. Idiot.
Hello, Caleb.
I spun around on the spot at the sound of my name, turning to see her, standing in a stream of sunlight that had broken between the leaves. I couldn't help the ridiculous grin from spreading across my face. She giggled, returning my smile. "You came," I said.
Of course I did.
Her eyes twinkled in amusement. I watched as she walked to sit on the same fallen tree trunk as before. It had begun to sink into the ground slightly, wet mud slowly swallowing it whole. I wondered for a second what that must feel like.
How old are you?
She asked, breaking the silence and pulling me from my thoughts. Her eyes were intense, searching my face as if to pull the answer straight from my head. 14, but I'll be 15 in a month and 3 days. I paused for a second before asking, "How old are you?"
I'm 15, but only just.
She smiled again. She looked older, I thought, taller than me by at least 2 inches, eyes so deep and knowing. She was brave, too, not awkward and blundering like myself. We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting in the clearing, her on her old oak trunk and me on the dry patch of ground with my sketchbook, a harvest man taking shape on the page. It felt so natural being here with her. The months I'd spent coming here alone began to feel foreign, like another life. We talked about our families, her mother, why they moved. She told me her father was an alcoholic and that he'd been killed trying to rob a store back home for money and liquor, shunned by the community and with nowhere to go or a penny to their name. The only option was Blackbird Creek. I didn't dare ask her what it was like out there, whether I was more scared to sound like an idiot or find out that all the stories were true. I don't know. She never mentioned it either, perhaps unaware of the gruesome tales we were fed in town. The next couple of weeks were spent the same. Each morning, I'd wake up to the early morning sun, pack my bag, and set off to see Lizzie. We'd spend our days talking, laughing, enjoying each other's company as she watched me fill my sketchbook. Each night, I'd come home as the sun set. Father would warn me about the witches in the swamp, and I'd always promise to stay away. Something not right, he'd mumble. Unnatural, he'd say. But I took no mind. By the time midsummer came, the sun shone hot. The previous near-constant rain didn't last long now, coming only in short bursts that lasted just long enough to keep the woods lush and green and allow the woodland to recover from the floods. I was thankful for it, too. Everything felt so green and alive, and for the first time in a long time, I felt alive, too.
Hello, Caleb.
A honey-sweet voice called from the tree line that separated us from the place we didn't go. I had to squint to make out her shape amongst the leaves of overgrown climbing plants. Lizzie, what are you doing?
What do you want to draw today?
She cut me off, her words ringing with a false happiness. I'm not sure yet.
Perhaps a woodlouse,
She suggested, from her shaded hiding spot. I took a step towards her, and then stopped myself. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't cross the invisible barrier to the creek. The stories of horrible monsters waiting in the dark filled my head, made my knees lock. Part of me, though, began to wonder how true those stories were, with the girl and her mother living just fine beyond the alder trees. Lizzie! I paused, but she didn't reply. What are you doing in there? We stood in silence for a moment before she sighed and took a hesitant step forward into the light. My hands balled into fists at the sight, knuckles turning white under the pressure. Her left eye, beautiful, rich, mossy green, was surrounded by an angry purple bruise that ended just above her sharp cheekbone. It shone like a violent beacon against her paper-white skin. What happened? I spat, working hard to keep my breathing even.
It's nothing.
Now it was my turn to cut her off. What happened? I asked again, calmer this time.
I went to town yesterday after we'd said goodbye. Mother needed some rabbit for supper. Only when I got to the butcher's, he told me my money was no good there. Told me he didn't do business with my kind, a witch from Blackbird. I tried to tell him I wasn't a witch, but he hit me. Told me if I ever went back, he'd...
A tear rolled down her delicate face. He'd what? I whispered.
He'd gut me like a pig. He pointed his knife at me, so I ran. Mother said we just have to try and hunt our own from now on.
She shrugged, and my mind swam with images of the butcher, his stinking shirt stained with the sweat that dripped from his disgusting, greasy face. What I'd have done if I'd been there to see him lay a single finger on her. I'd gut him myself. Before I knew it, my legs had pushed me forward, arms curling round Lizzie's thin frame. She stiffened at first, and then relaxed into my body and wrapped her arms around my neck. She smelled like lavender, and I never wanted to let her go. After what felt like both a lifetime and not enough time at all, she pulled away, wiping her nose on the back of her hand.
Thanks.
She mumbled, mouth pulling up at one corner in a hesitant smile. I returned the gesture. She sniffed.
You're not like everyone else in town, you know. You're kind, warm. You're safe.
My heart thumped so hard I was afraid it might burst out of my chest. And in that moment, I decided I would do anything to protect her, to be her safe place. The rest of the afternoon was spent sitting at the base of an alder tree, knees touching, listening to the leaves rustle and branches creak happily in the afternoon breeze. This time, when it was time to say goodbye, Lizzie pulled me to my feet and wrapped her arms around me again.
I wish you didn't have to go.
She mumbled into my neck. Me too, was all I said. And with that, she turned and walked back through the trees. That night, Father wasn't in his usual spot at the kitchen table. A meat pie sat in his place instead. A small note scribbled next to it.
Caleb, had to go out. Don't know when I'll be back. Whatever you don't eat, cover with a cloth and leave be. Father.
I frowned to myself. Father never goes out unless it's to work and always stops for vegetables and meat and whatever else we need on the way home. I sat in my chair and held my hands together in front of me. Dear Lord, I pray that you keep watch over my soul in these the darkest of nights, for black shadows creep unseen to try and claim that which I devote to you. Amen. I ate in silence by myself, mind swimming with thoughts of Lizzie and her bruised face. I hadn't even noticed the time when the front door opened, Father's huffing breaths audible from the hall. I'd usually be in bed by now, so he was surprised to see me still sitting at my seat, half-eaten pie still on the table.
You managed then?
He said gruffly, his voice tired and thick. Yes, where have you been?
Emergency in town. At Jim's butcher's. Jim,
He dropped down into his chair, running a weathered hand through his coarse black and silver peppered hair.
They found him this afternoon. Dead. Cut from neck to stomach. I don't...
He just sat then, eyes focused on a scratch in the kitchen table. Dead? I asked. He didn't look up, just nodded his head.
Lads were talking again. Said they saw one of them girls from Blackbird in Jim's yesterday. Said he scared her off good and proper. Takes a funny sort to live out there. Not right if you ask me.
You think they did it? I blurted in panic. My heart lurched at the thought of him accusing Lizzie, at the thought that she could do anything like that. His eyes fixed on mine quickly, angry.
Strange things happening lately, boy. Weather changed the second them girls moved to The second they moved down there. No word of where they came from, no explanation at all, and now Jim. I ain't the only one who noticed either. You mark my words, something's brewing. I know it.
He slammed his open palm on the table. I stared at him in silence, mind swimming with thoughts of Lizzie and her mother. He focused again on the same spot on the kitchen table for a moment, before standing slowly, reaching for a bottle of amber liquid on top of the cabinets, and taking it off to bed. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I laid awake until the sun rose. All I could think of was running to Lizzie, to warn her before it was too late. Of what, though? I didn't know. The next day, I found Lizzie already on her usual tree trunk. The bark was beginning to peel in places, baked dry in the hot sun. It left little brown flecks on the hem of her dress. I need to talk to you, I called to her the moment I stepped into the clearing, but she didn't seem to notice the urgency in my voice.
Oh, hello,
she said, eyes not quite focused under knitted brows. I made my way over to sit beside her, nudging her knee gently with my own. What's wrong?
Mother said they found the butcher dead,
she said, hands twisting together anxiously in her lap. I nodded with a sigh. Yes, my father told me last night. I paused for a second, gulping before reaching out and placing one of my hands on hers. She stopped fidgeting immediately and laced her fingers through mine. Are you okay? I asked.
Yes. No. I don't know. What if they think I had something to do with it?
Well, you didn't, I said matter-of-factly.
You believe me? You don't think I'm a swamp witch?
Her eyes locked hard on mine, searching like always, as if to pull the answer straight from my head. Of course not. And even if you were, it wouldn't matter to me. I shrugged. She stared at me for a few moments longer, eyes glistening with an unshed tear, before leaning in just slightly. I did the same until we came to meet in the middle. Our lips brushed for only a second, but in that moment, I felt as though I could live 1,000 lifetimes and never be as happy as I was right then and there, on that old tree trunk with Lizzie.
Caleb!
A low, gruff voice shouted from the wood entrance. I turned my head so quickly I thought my neck might break to see my father standing in the opening of the clearing. A gathering of people I recognized from town at his back.
What the fuck are you doing, boy?
He marched over to us in pure fury, wrapping his coarse hand in the collar of my shirt and yanking me away. Lizzie stood there, eyes darting between the faces of people she didn't know. Father, stop, was all I managed to say before the shouts began. He's been hypnotized, someone cried. A spell. She's cursed him, came another voice. I tried again to speak and to shake my father's fist from my collar, but his grip never loosened.
Your mind has been poisoned,
he said, venom leaking from every word. A man I recognized as the town sheriff stepped past us, coming to stand at the front of the mob, just a few feet from Lizzie. She began to wring her hands together again, her skin reddening under the pressure. "You've been found guilty by the good townspeople of witchcraft. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" His booming voice filled the clearing, made the leaves shake and branches creak.
What?
Was all Lizzie managed to say before her throat closed around a sob. "If you've nothing to say and no proof to the contrary, then I hereby declare that you are indeed a witch, the crime of which is punishable by death. Officer?" The sheriff turned to a man in the crowd. He took a long, quick stride towards Lizzie before losing his footing on the uneven ground. His neck caught hard between the low-hanging vine of a climber plant, beautiful ivy leaves tangling in his hair. And with a loud snap and a quiet gurgle, he was still. Somewhere behind him came a scream. "She killed him!" someone yelled. "Swamp witch!" "No!" I shouted, barely audible above the growing chants echoing around the clearing. I looked at Lizzie, her face warped with terror, and mouthed the word, "Run." She turned on her heel and made for the tree line, slipping between the alders as quick as her legs would allow. I followed soon after, finally free of Father's grasp. I prayed that the trees would close behind me as I ran through the undergrowth. I'd never crossed the line before, the invisible barrier that separated us from the swamp. I don't know what I expected to find on the other side. The stories depicting stinking wastelands, dark shadows threatening to steal your soul were all we knew. But when I stumbled through to the other side, I was blindsided by the beauty. Weeping willows, wildflowers, the smell of lavender dancing in the air. It wasn't a swamp. It was a meadow. "Lizzie!" I screamed as loud as my aching lungs would allow. I looked around frantically before my eyes landed on the little cabin in the near distance. I ignored the screaming in my legs and lungs as I forced myself over to the soggy bank of deep brown waters, reaching the door as rumbling footfall and booming voices filled the open space. I could have sworn I heard someone screaming in disbelief that the trees had moved, grabbing at them as they passed through. I banged on the door with closed fists, Lizzie's name spilling from my mouth like an unrelenting tidal wave, desperation gripping me like a vice.
"Caleb?"
she cried as she opened the door, pulling me in quick and locking it again behind her. "They're coming. They're here. They're," I panted, stars filling my vision. "I swear, I didn't."
I know,
she said, tears flowing freely now.
"Is this your Caleb?"
Came a voice I didn't recognize. A woman stood at the foot of the stairs, bags in hand, golden hair wild around her pale face. Lizzie nodded. I straightened, resting a hand on my aching chest, an apology forming on my tongue.
"We need to leave,"
said the woman. "Then I'm coming too," I said. I laced my fingers through Lizzie's again. "I'm not going to leave you. I can't leave you." She squeezed her delicate fingers hard against my knuckles in understanding. In agreement.
"Come then,"
said Lizzie's mother.
"We have to go now."
As she pulled open the door, we were met with the smell of burning, wet, smoking burning. The crowd had gathered by the water, a fire spewing black clouds of ash into the air at the trunk of a mutilated willow, its once magnificent branches used as tinder. "There they are!" someone screamed, and I locked eyes with my father for only a moment before the mob rushed forward again. Some were battered and bloodied, hair thick with twigs and leaves with thorns sticking from their skin. They were on us in an instant, something hard and heavy hitting me in the stomach and knocking all the oxygen from my body. I hit the floor as Lizzie and her mother screamed, clawed, kicked as hard as they could against those who grabbed them. "Stop!" I tried to say, but the words wouldn't come. "Stop!" I tried again, this time only a whisper. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl. Raindrops began to fall in gentle splashes against my skin. Stars filled my vision again as I took in as much air as my lungs would allow, balling my free hand into a fist and hitting the ground as hard as I could. "Stop!" I screamed. My voice cracked thunderously along with the ground, a thin crater splitting open the earth and spreading a few feet in front of me to reveal a thick root of the willow tree. Did I do that? Suddenly everything was quiet, the only sounds being the crackling of damp wood and raindrops hitting the ground.
I pushed myself up slowly, standing to meet the open-mouthed stares of the mob. "Put them down," I commanded, but no one moved. I said, "Put them down!" The flaming willow tree swayed in ways I wouldn't have thought possible, its remaining branches snaking around one of the men's legs, the one that was holding my Lizzie. In one quick movement, the branches separated, pulling the man's legs from his body with a sickening ripping sound. His torso landed with a heavy thud on the meadow floor. Lizzie looked at me, fear flickering in her eyes for a moment before fading completely, replaced by a look I recognized. The same look she had in the woods that day. The day she said, "I felt safe." She grabbed her mother's hand and pulled her from the sheriff's grip, coming to stand behind me. I heard Lizzie's mother quietly ask frantic questions, but Lizzie didn't answer. "You," my father stepped forward, a look of betrayal and confusion on his face. "It was you?" I didn't answer. "He's a witch," someone in the mob muttered, and soon the chanting started again. Father looked at me, then back to the crowd, shaking his head. The sheriff took a few tentative steps forward, followed closely by the townspeople. "No!" I said. The crack in the ground grew at my voice, the roots of the willow tree seeming to push the earth open under their feet. When they didn't stop, the roots rose from the dirt and grabbed at the mob, lifting them high into the air before slamming their bodies back down hard against the meadow floor. The wildflowers misted red with blood as the roots dragged whatever was left of their bodies into the now flooding hole in the ground, slowly burying both dead and alive. A few mob members were already turned to run, making their way quickly towards the woods. The alder trees bent their branches, grabbing and ripping at those who tried to flee. The sheriff was caught by a snaking vine that pushed its way into his mouth, pulling out whatever insides it could with its thorny grip. I was too caught up in the horror to notice my father had come to crouch his body in front of me, his hands placed on both of my shoulders. "Caleb," he said loudly through the screams. "Please, boy, stop," he begged. I looked at him, his eyes the same muddy brown as my own. Suddenly the meadow was still, the rain quickly dissipating. "Would you have stopped?" I asked. "What?" He rested a hand on my cheek, a gesture he hadn't done since I was small, before putting it back on my shoulder. "Would you have stopped?" I repeated. "Or would you have allowed them to burn Lizzie and her mother alive?" I asked plainly. He sighed, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, boy." I stepped away from him, letting his arms fall to his sides. "I should have known," he said, looking at the ground this time. "Your mother, she was special. Not like this, no, of course, not like this, but she was special. She used to sit in those woods, listening to the trees creaking in the breeze. You're so much like her, Caleb." I'd never seen my father cry, even when my mother fell ill, even when she died and we buried her in the church graveyard in town. He never cried then, but he did now. "I should have known you were different, but I never imagined this." He gestured around us, quiet for a moment before asking again. "Please, Caleb, stop." I felt another hand on my shoulder, this one delicate and gentle. I turned to see Lizzie, eyes glistening with tears as she nodded her head.
"It's okay. It's over,"
she said. I turned my attention to the meadow, limbs stuck high in the treetops, headless torsos floating in the muddy water. It was quiet. The trees were still. "I'm sorry," I began, turning to face Lizzie. "They couldn't hurt you. I couldn't bear it. I didn't know this would happen. I didn't." She placed her hand over my mouth, silencing me immediately before throwing her arms around me and burying her face in my neck.
"It's over,"
she said again.
"I'm safe."
And with that, I knew it was going to be all right. As long as I had Lizzie, as long as she was safe, I knew everything was going to be all right.
I didn't notice her at first, too distracted by my sketchbook and the beginnings of a caterpillar doodled carefully on the page.
Papa?
Yes, sweetheart, I hummed, looked up to meet her muddy brown eyes.
Can you teach me?
Of course, I smiled, pulling my daughter onto my lap. We sat together in the warm summer sun that broke through the canopy as she drew each little prickly hair onto the spine of the caterpillar.
She's getting good,
Lizzie said, watching us fondly from her spot on the old oak trunk. My breath caught in my throat, still floored by the woman who allowed me to love her. Proud of our work, Willow and I joined Lizzie by the trunk, listening to the creaking of the trees. Sometimes, Willow and I would talk to them, and sometimes they'd talk back. So this next story ranks the lowest on likes for some reason, even though in my opinion it is one of the best written stories that I did. And it's by the author P.F. McGrail. He also did the Hospital series that Romnex covered. Excellently, I might add. She's my favorite narrator, in case you didn't know. And I try to push people toward him every chance I get. He is a talented author, and he is available on Amazon in paperback or as a Kindle download. I highly recommend him. I was grateful that he allowed me to read this story. And I kind of went a different direction with this, although I'm always playing with sound. I've had some people complain in the comments that I don't sound the same all the time, I think is kind of the paraphrase. It seems like some people that have listened to me aren't crazy about me doing the wide variety of stories that I do. Perhaps if this wasn't a hobby channel, or I was just making a money grab, trying to be big time, and wanted to polish it up and make it all branded, I would uniform it and keep the same sound and do the same kind of narrations. But this is a fun channel for me. This is where I blow off steam, get the stink of the work week off of me, and just have fun. So I'm a little bit all over the road with my story choices, and that's okay, and it's probably going to continue. Sometimes my voice is going to sound different. Sometimes I'm going to try on an accent. And sometimes I'm probably just going to put out a big old stinker of a story, and it's just not going to do as well as others, and that's okay too. The point is, I'm not trying to be a Dark Somnium, or a Creepypasta, or a Mr. Creepypasta, or anyone else. I'm just being Stone over here. So, let me get down off this soapbox, and without further ado, here's a fun little gritty story that I did, once again, by P.F. McGrail. Check him out. And it's called Cleaners. I work for the cleaners, or at least I used to. You're not supposed to know what that is, and I'm not supposed to tell you. The world is filled with things that aren't supposed to happen. Yet here we are. You probably think I'm full of shit. That's because we're really fucking good at what we do. Concealing your past isn't about hiding it. Nah, if you really want to keep a secret, you gotta play a Jedi mind trick so fucking well that people can hear the secret and actually believe they're choosing to reject it of their own free will. Just like you are. Right now. You can sit there, staring at your screen as I tell you everything, or at least as much of everything that needs to be shared in the moment, and there's not a goddamn thing I can say to make you believe the truth. You were designed that way. We're that fucking good. On January 31st, 1976, this fight broke out in a shithole bar in Phoenix, Arizona. The fight got ugly. knife appeared from somewhere, and a dirtbag named Ernesto got stabbed to death. We never hid that fact, yet you were unaware of it until this moment. That knowledge has been laid out for all the world to see, which is precisely why no one noticed. You're not familiar with double jeopardy, right? You can't get tried twice for the same crime, even if you react to your not guilty verdict by jumping on the table and screaming, "I skull-fucked her to death, you turd muffins." That's a problem, right? Do you really think that the US government, an entity that put a magical flying machine on the goddamn moon 66 short years ago after the invention of the airplane, was unable to solve said problem? How is it that drug kingpins and mob bosses don't regularly ransack nice suburban homes? If one out of 10,000 individuals was willing to rain chaos upon society, don't you realize that it would be enough to create anarchy? Aren't you grateful for the cleaners? In 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned a conviction in Miranda versus Arizona. It was no secret that Miranda, a career criminal, had kidnapped an 18-year-old girl and raped her to his heart's content. But the police had done something equally as shitty, by giving the guy a get-out-of-jail-free card. What to do? In a totally unrelated story, Ernesto Miranda spent most of the following decade behind bars, just as he had spent much of his time on Earth. But when he got out again, the man dived right back into the crime that had determined the course of his entire life. That life was cut short by the mysterious knife in a seedy Phoenix bar in 1976, making everyone just a little bit safer. It's funny how things work out. I was driving through Hell's Kitchen in the middle of the night a couple of years back. Tim sat in the passenger seat. He was a quiet fella. "You know that building dates back to 1913? I asked him casually. "There's a lot of history in this neighborhood." "Yep. Used to be extremely dangerous, even by New York standards. There was a time, a few years back, when I'd never drive through here at this time of night. Not a chance. The air was cool, and my hand was hanging outside of the window. Not even in my 1999 Toyota Corolla." I patted the exterior door. "Still, I make sure to stay safe by driving the Blue Beast. Both flashy cars and extremely shitty ones attract attention. But this car's a wallflower." I looked over at Tim and smiled. "And you know that wallflowers have the most poisonous blossoms." I pulled my unassuming car into an unassuming lot next to a very boring warehouse. I got out, opened Tim's door, unbuckled his seatbelt, and wrapped my arms around his chest. No one noticed me as I dragged him from the car and into the nearby abandoned building. Tim didn't speak a word of protest as I helped him into the polyethylene drum. My butthole puckered just by getting near the damn sulfuric acid, but he didn't even twitch. I sighed behind my mask. "Bye, Tim. Thanks for listening. Sorry you were such a piece of shit." His left eye sizzled as the acid rolled over it, then melted like an ice cube before slipping deep into his skull. It was completely gone before the unblinking right eye was even touched by the stuff. In the moment before his head melted, it almost looked like he was winking at me. No one came looking for Tim. And in a story that I assure you is totally unrelated, experts continue to be shocked by the ever-dwindling crime rates in New York City. Like most people, I rarely used to question my own morality. No one could ever raise two armies to fight each other if both sides spent much time considering who was objectively right. We think that our actions are justified because we do them, and not vice versa. I didn't question why I needed to clean. I just picked up the paper files, I worked, and a sack of cash would be waiting in a drab-looking bag within an hour. Considering that I had a choice was discomforting, so I decided not to consider it. It's really fucking hard to deal with how deep I'd gotten into case 1913 before I finally stopped to think. I found myself in the apartment, watching her as though I'd arrived by magic. There was no thinking before that juncture. I had been led by routine. I watched Mildred Cunningham, 82 years old, shuffle from her kitchen to the living room so that she could rest. Nothing more. She just needed to sit down. I stared. The choke cord was dangling from my fingers. The 9mm sat heavily in my pocket, and I was totally obscured in her broom closet. That's when I wondered, why? Why am I about to take the last couple of years from someone who wants nothing more than a quiet place to sit and rest? Mildred sat and breathed, and nothing more. It was the saddest thing I think I'd ever seen. I walked out of the closet, gave her a smile and a nod, and disappeared out the door. She smiled vaguely back. It's amazing what you can convince people is normal when you act like there's nothing wrong. Fear galvanizes some of us and cripples others. You can't ever know how you'll react, because most people never taste fear in its rawest form. That kind of terror drenches every thought, every movement, every sense. It enhances the moment in 1,000 unpredictable ways. The only assurance is that it cannot be ignored. You can't just walk away from being a cleaner. I will always be one, which isn't entirely a bad thing. The first men were set to intercept me as I exited the building. They waited for an hour before realizing I'd given them the slip. They found me in Schenectady. I was hiding under Whipple Bridge, my Glock sitting nearby, and a bottle of Mr. Daniels in my hand. The first one had snatched my Glock away before I could turn to face him. "You look like a hobo, Agent Q. I expected more." The observation was efficient. Young, maybe 21, eager to prove himself, standing off to the side so that I wouldn't turn 180 degrees around. He didn't look down at my pistol as he aimed it at me. He didn't give the bottle of Jack a second glance. I looked devastated. I knew this because I could see it reflecting in his eyes. He didn't look anywhere but at me. I've cultivated this look through meticulous forethought. I sighed, brushing some of the dust off my trench coat. "How many assignments have been illegitimate?" I asked miserably. "Illegitimate?" he shot back. "You killed people for a living, Agent. Whatever lies you told yourself have become your truth." I stared down at the bottle. "I've been able to convince myself of the best lies I've ever written, but you're about to do something that can never be undone." I glanced back up at him. "You're going to do it with my own Glock?" I leaned away as he took a step closer. I watched where his eyes didn't look. What would you tell someone just before they shuffle off their mortal coil? I've always had so many questions I wasn't allowed to ask. He squeezed the trigger as my heart raced in fear. My Glock exploded as I spun around and splashed the contents of my bottle into the face of the man who had been hiding behind me. He screamed as the liquid coated his skin. He was too distracted to stop me from leaping back to use him as a human shield. I assumed the first man wouldn't dare shoot at his friend while sulfuric acid was melting his face off. But it turns out the first man was a shitty friend. I ducked in behind the face melter as he screamed inches from my ear, stealing the Glock he was hiding in his waistband. He was hard to use as a human shield because he was jittering all around and globs of unholy skin and sulfuric acid goop were flying every which way. But I held him just steady enough to get 5 seconds of human shield use out of him. "You set me up with a gun ready to explode, you piece of shit!" The first man screamed as he produced a second gun and aimed it at me. My human shield screamed louder as blood exploded from his leg. "You shot your dying friend in the knee and I'm the piece of shit? How'd you know we were coming for you?" This douche nozzle was not focused on the task at hand. I threw the bottle high into the air. He looked up for half a second. I pushed his bleeding friend away from me and shot into the air. The acid bottle exploded just above the first man's head. Oh, did he scream. In response to your first question, I heaved, I'm very good at what I do. The local police initially figured that it was either gang violence or a domestic dispute.
When the hobo in the dirty trench coat approached them to offer his eyewitness account, they dismissed him. Serious police work has no time for raving schizophrenics. I turned away from the 2 men I'd killed as the cops shooed me from the scene. I'm good in a pinch, and objectively better than they were that day. I believe I still am. I've tricked myself into believing that fact just strongly enough to make it true. But the past never goes away, any more than the back of your skull disappears because you can't see it. I've always dealt in fear, sure that I was in control of my drug. That's the kind of self-assurance that keeps people from realizing how much trouble they're in until it's far too late. Now I need that drug to keep me alive. My circulatory system pumps at a continuous stream of fear through every part of me. And that's the only reason I'm still alive. And that's how this whole shit show began. It's not the reason so many people died, but it's the reason those particular people died. My name used to be Agent Q. Now, I'm nobody at all.
This story is the second most popular story of 2021, with like 141 likes, I believe. It was a lot. For me, my little channel, it was a big hit. So I want to share it with you. This was released in the end of March, and it is called Eyes for the Dead. My mother had a cat named Thimble who stalked me when I was a child. I was 10 or so at the time, and I had just witnessed my first death in the family. I say Thimble stalked me because it was obvious she was following me around, but she chose not to come too close. Always a little distance away, on the couch or in the middle of the carpet, watching me. She wouldn't come over to lie at my feet or jump onto my lap. She wouldn't respond to anyone calling her. She just sat there, placidly, looking at me. Every now and then, those gold-flecked green eyes would dart over my shoulder, and then to me, back and forth, like someone was waving a laser pointer around my head that only she could see. But she would make no further move. She would watch me in silence until she grew heavy-lidded with drowsiness and settled down on her paws to snooze, still in the middle of the carpet. It became a kind of family tradition, an expectation that if anyone were looking for her, they would find her next to me. I can still find old photographs, candid shots of myself as a young boy in Sunday clothes, seated at the table in the foreground, glancing to the side, where Thimble sat on the floor, a little way into the distance, like she hadn't been invited and wanted us to know she was displeased about it. Her dispassionate little face would be turned my way, as if she were tasked to supervise me, and found it an especially dull job, but one she took seriously. Years later, when she was old and dying, I visited her little den at the bottom of a bookcase where my mother had covered the opening with an embroidered, tasseled cloth. I would pull back the cloth and peer into the darkness as though spying into a shrine or a sacred little gravesite for the still living. I would find the gently heaving mound of fur, lying prone and stiff, facing away from the entrance, and gaze at her white and ginger coat, half glowing in the dim space. Just as I determined she was still breathing, a hand would yank me back roughly by the collar, usually my mother or Nan or my oldest brother scolding me about disturbing her. reminding me about how cats needed to be alone when they were nearing their end. The cloth would be respectfully replaced, and I would be kicked out into the sunshine. Dying alone. It always seemed such an unbearably sad way for someone to go, I thought. So I kept checking, kept getting in trouble for it. She'll never die peacefully at this rate, my mother would say. She meant to emphasize the peacefulness or the lack of it, but I focused on the death. I thought if I visited Thimble enough, I could disturb her, distract her out of dying. She had been in the den 3 days. She should have died much earlier, I heard. So it must have been working. On the afternoon of the 4th day, certain that there was nobody close by, I lifted the shroud and glanced in, pretending to check on her water dish. Thimble had moved for the first time, lying on her other side so that her face was toward me, her paws stretched straight out, and seemingly already stiff with death. But as I watched her closed-up face, her eyes slowly opened, the secondary eyelid a moment delayed so that for a second or so, her eyes were entirely and then partly white and shielded. She looked otherworldly, possessed, but now her eyes were open, her faded green pupils contracting to slits from the light of the hall. She stared sleepily at me without expression or pain, or even recognition. And then, just like all the times in the past I've grown accustomed to, her gaze flicked over my shoulder, as though someone were there trying to get her attention. But of course, there was nobody there. There never was anybody there, every time I'd ever looked behind me in my childhood. Just as surely as I'd grown used to this glance, I had grown secure in the knowledge that there was nothing, that there would never be anything, and that this was just something odd that all cats did. This time, however, there was a small difference in how she behaved. A slight difference, but one I remember clearly and with apprehension, knowing what I know now. She flicked her tail and narrowed her eyes as though she were annoyed. Her ear twitched, her tail flicked once, twice, then fell still. She did not glance back at me. Her eyes were now glazed and unseeing over my shoulder. The faint light of defiance in the graceful lines of her face dimmed out, and her breathing returned to its steady, slow pace until she ceased to move again. I scrambled up to run and find someone and announce Thimble's death. I don't remember feeling anything in particular other than a mild pang and, at the end, a vague curiosity. I never got to understand her. Cats die with their secrets. Hers was the second death I had ever witnessed, and she would be among the first of many. The first was my strange Grandma Elizabeth, from Dad's side of the family. You could say she started everything. I was 9, going on 10. Thimble had just been brought into the house as a kitten. Her stalking would begin a few months later. I would never be the same after Grandma came to live with us for the short time we had known her, but I didn't know it at the time. Thimble would be the first to notice what had changed. For reasons withheld from us, my parents had kept Grandma Elizabeth away from the family when we were growing up, and as far as I know, Grandma never made an attempt to connect with her estranged son and the grandchildren she had never met. There was some talk about her being difficult, even before she had been widowed,
and my parents didn't want us growing up with that sort of damage. So, we never got to know her. She never got to know us. Then, toward the end of her life, she made a sudden, mysterious introduction into our home. She was dying, our father explained to us, and she was alone. Nobody should ever die alone. So, she was given the guest room upstairs, and so far gone was she that I don't think we've really ever met in any real sense of the word. We might have been vague presences flitting about her room, sent up to check on her for all she was aware. All we knew of her in life before her illness were what little our parents spoke of her, and what survived in photo albums. Just one face among other strangers, dead before we were born. Just like with Thimble, I was the last to see her alive. Knowing what I know now, I turn the scene over in my mind every so often, wondering what I could have done to change how things would turn out. I still wonder whether any of it had been my fault, or if I had just been in the wrong place, wrong time. I remember the chill of the air, the dim light behind the curtains in the guest room where Grandma Elizabeth had died. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had gone completely unresponsive. The family had taken to visiting her in turns. It had been a few weeks of no change, no improvement. She was in a coma, a vegetable. It had been my turn to be sent upstairs to check on whether she, to put it bluntly, had left yet. Not yet, I realized, watching the glass fog up on the tiny pocket mirror I held up to her nose, the way I was taught to do. We couldn't even tell she was breathing under those blankets. But just as I was about to head off and report the lack of change to my parents, Grandma made a sound. The kind of sound I imagined she might have made when she was so angry she lost her words, but not her voice. The sound was dry, scratchy, a bit warped, and lower down in her throat than I expected it to be. But the anger, I felt, was there. I had frozen in place and turned back around. Her eyes were wide open, glassy, staring at the ceiling. I had recently learned the term death rattle, which I had read somewhere in a book, and wondered if this was it. Gingerly, I crept over with the mirror to see if I could catch her last breath. But just as I reached out, her hand shot out and found my wrist. The only sudden movement, in fact, the only real movement she had made for days. She held on, her frailty leaving her for a moment so that her hand on mine was like the talons of a bird of prey. I dropped the mirror in shock and pain, and it bounced once on the duvet and stayed there, blinking back the dim light at me. I couldn't make a sound. Her eyes were still wide and glassy, points of pale green light reflected in her irises like the mirror lying on the duvet. And now, they were looking at me, or at least in my direction. I couldn't tell if she could even register my presence, much less recognize me. Neither her hand nor her eyes let me go. The sound came again from her throat, whispery now, like she was trying to tell me something without being able to move her lips, like she was trapped in her own failing body, trying to reach out to me for help. The idea of it frightened me more than the fact that she was dying, or the fact that she was already dead, that she had died looking into my eyes, her hand on mine, helplessly, struck mute. I stared back until the noise died away, and her eyes were as flat to me as those of a fish. Her hand did not loosen from my wrist, Already they were tightening in rigor mortis. She had escaped her body with her last breath, but now I was the trapped one. I remember distinctly that I wished I had left the door open. Eventually, my family found me, standing there by the bed, stock still, and unable to speak for several moments. I had moved my hand to rest on top of Grandma Lisbeth's, as though to console her, but the lifelessness of her skin had stopped me cold, and I made no effort to pry myself free. They figured I was in shock. I had apparently been there for all of 10 minutes, but that number meant nothing to me. I don't remember feeling afraid, but I felt that something had changed, and I wasn't sure I liked it. For most of my childhood, I had locked that scene out of memory, able to recall it now with little signs of trauma, as just an odd fact of my personal history. I had never drawn a connection between Grandma Lisbeth and Thimble. Even at that age, I had witnessed the crossing over more times than anyone in my family. But I only realized this the moment I burst into the living room to find my family and tell them the cat had finally died. One of my elder brothers had made a snide comment, perhaps miffed he hadn't caught me bothering Thimble when it had been his job to watch me. He said, "I see the angel of death has another report for us." It was such a toss-away comment, it was easy to dismiss it at the time and simply focus on the task at hand of finding a shoebox to bury Thimble in. But thinking back on it, I realize he was right. Grandma had only been able to die when I was in the room, and the same thing happened with Thimble. I didn't know why that was until I witnessed the next death. The following summer, after Thimble died, my mother gave birth to our youngest brother, making us a family of 5 boys. He almost didn't make it, cord around the neck, but finally came through with apparently no further problems. That close brush with death and the fact that he was born sickly, as most 5th children are, made him the darling of the family. I, for one, showed no special affection for the newest sibling, who was named Todd. Yet he clung to me the most outside of our mother. He hadn't even taken much to Nan, whom we all loved in that distant, hesitant way of young boys. Naturally, my mother encouraged this bond between us brothers and often left young Todd in my care. At 13 months, Todd hadn't yet learned to speak. One weekend morning, I almost wished he could. I had been tasked to help Nan feed him while he sat imprisoned in his high chair at the kitchen table. All he could do to protest was wave his arms about and gurgle whenever I was successful in getting a half spoon of gloop past his defenses. Nan sighed and got up from the table to go find a clean washcloth. Once she was gone, I relaxed in my efforts, and then I noticed that Todd had gone silent too. I glanced at him, relieved, but his expression gave me pause. He was looking intently at me as though confused by what he was seeing. It was almost comical seeing a worry crease on a baby's forehead, like seeing an infant dressed up in a businessman's suit and tie. He was gazing into my face, for once not responding to my smile, and then, as if perfectly trained by the cat Thimble, who had died before he was born, he glanced over my shoulder. I turned and saw the creeping white roses of our wallpaper, dimmed by my shadow. Nothing else. I looked back around. Todd continued to watch, flicking his eyes to something just a little behind my head. Something completely insensible to me. He would not, of course, answer any of my questions as to what he was seeing. Nan came into the kitchen then, happy at how I had gotten Todd to behave. I was rather unnerved and said nothing. As soon as I picked up the spoon, Todd went reassuringly berserk again. That would be the first time of many that I would catch him staring at me and over my shoulder, and I had to learn all over again not to look, to get used to the fact that I would not find anything. But I was no longer sure that there was nothing. I still maintained that Thimble had been more intelligent than a toddler, but somehow I had to take the knowing glance of a human being a little more seriously than that of a cat, whose ways are always easily misconstrued by people. For years, I never sensed anything off about Todd aside from that glance, and neither did anybody else. He never glanced like that over anyone else's shoulders, just as Thimble hadn't, only at me. And just as my family had marveled at Thimble following me around, they marveled at how Todd latched on to me. Photos of my early adolescent years now featured a toddler rather than a cat, standing or sitting some distance away, always at a distance, content to just watch me, sometimes for hours on end. Mother made a joking comment once about how I must have had a very engaging aura, but we both knew she was just being a tease. I couldn't in good faith say I was anything above ordinary. And I know for a fact I did not have this curious magnetic effect on other cats or other children I knew at the time. Just Thimble. Just Todd. I had noticed in Thimble as well that her attraction to me was hardly about me. She was primarily our mother's cat, rescued as a near-dead kitten in a ditch outside Mother's workplace. And as she grew up and settled in at home, she didn't give a rat's ass about me or my brothers, but whatever it was that held her attention, it was happening just over my shoulder. I sensed this same indifferent fascination with Todd. He was growing quieter than any of us boys, uncommonly quiet, even more so when he looked at me. He didn't shriek with delight or call out to me in a cheerful way of children calling for attention. He merely looked and went quiet and stayed by my side, a little distance away, on the floor or in his walker, or later, when he could stand on his own, stopped picture still in the doorway or on the middle of the carpet, tracking me with his eyes. All that was familiar to me too, thanks to Thimble, but with one notable difference I could look forward to. Todd would grow up at some point, and he would be able to talk. And, unlike Thimble, he would be able to tell me what or who, angel or devil, had lingered over my shoulder for as long as he had known me. Todd never did learn to speak the usual way. He had developed an infection that almost killed him at 2 years old. But though he survived, he had lost the use of his vocal cords. He learned to sign instead, and he was 7 when I was showing him photos of Thimble, many of them photos featuring me as a younger boy, a little older than he was now. We sat together at the low coffee table in the living room, with family photo albums spread out before us. I was trying to keep him occupied until Nan returned from an errand to dismiss me from service, but I didn't mind. I'd grown up used to Todd's company and even come to appreciate it. He was an easy kid, intelligent, thoughtful. "It's strange to see you alone here," he signed, pointing to a photo of me when I was much younger. I couldn't place the age in the photo, but it was definitely before Grandma Lisbeth came to live with us, even before Thimble. There were 4 boys instead of 5, me being the youngest at the time. But I wasn't alone. It was a family photo, all the brothers, side by side. Alone, What do you mean? I said. You're almost never alone, Todd signed, then gestured at my more recent photos. It's always the both of you now. Both of us? Now? I wanted to repeat my question, but it wouldn't come out. He must have read it off my face because he signed again. Both of you. This time, he pulled one of the older photo albums closer and opened it to a picture of Grandma Lisbeth when she was alive and absent from our lives. Grandma, Todd signed. He pointed at the picture, then pointed at me, over my shoulder. This time, I looked around. Still, I saw nothing, but felt something different in my newfound awareness, a tightening in my chest as realization crept under my skin. I remembered in a flash the scene at Grandma's deathbed, the way she had snatched at my hand the moment her heart had stopped, the keen sense I had of her being trapped somehow, being helpless to release her, though her hand had not released me from the impossible request. When little Todd pointed over my shoulder and signed, Grandma, what I remembered most was not her eyes or the wincing pain of her fingers clawed into my wrist, but the sound in her throat, the strange, misplaced anger in it. Had she escaped after all? Or was she still trapped here, holding on to me the way she had held on to my wrist? Todd still stared at me, waiting for my reply. Instead of denial or doubt, I only felt the chill of understanding. I felt sick. I tried not to let it show. Tried to focus on my little brother's gentle, living face to keep me anchored in the moment. Is she still there now? I asked, not helping how my voice dropped as if to keep her from hearing. Despite my best efforts, my voice came out a bit shaky. Is she always there? Often, signed Todd. Not always. She's not here now, but she was. I nodded as though this was expected, but my mind was whirling, trying to catch up. I was thinking of Thimble. How come you don't talk to her? Todd asked next, taking advantage of my disorientation to press the issue about Grandma. I noticed nobody talks to her, or about her. We didn't know her too well, and we can't hear her, I said honestly, but was unsure what else to tell him. What could I say? We can't see her? She isn't even supposed to be here? Why not? He asked, predictably. She can't talk, I said. It's like how you can't talk. Some people can't talk. She can't. I had to stop myself short. I couldn't bring myself to lie to him outright, not when he knew things we did not. He was looking at me strangely now, disbelieving. I think she can talk, he signed. I paused. You hear her? I asked, and he nodded without hesitation. Does she talk to you? This time he had to think about it for a moment. He shook his head, then shrugged. His uncertainty unnerved me. She's trying to say something, he signed finally. At least I think she is, but it isn't in words. She just makes a sound. I stared at him. What do you mean? What sound? He hesitated. Then his hand hovered somewhere uncertainly over his neck, before lightly clasping his own throat. He was having trouble describing what he was hearing, but I understood, all too well. That death rattle, that sound deep down in her throat, unexpectedly angry, a strangled sound. Todd lowered his hand when he saw that I understood his meaning. Does she? I paused, found my nerve, tried again. Does she sound angry? Instead of answering, he glanced over my shoulder, under his eyelashes, then averted his eyes. He nodded. Yes, yes, she sounds angry. She hadn't escaped after all. And just like all those years ago, standing by her deathbed, she had latched onto me in her failure to escape. And, just like all those years ago, I felt helpless to do anything about it. I'm sorry, I whispered back to him. And I was. I was sorry he had to see that. See what I had seen on that wasted face years ago. The unseeing look in Grandma's eyes. And to keep seeing it when the rest of us were mercifully blind, mercifully deaf. Todd wouldn't look up at me. I had to ask, does she scare you? A frown crinkled his brow as he thought about it, wanting to give me an honest reply. He had seen her over my shoulder for as long as he had been alive. Could that familiarity have dulled the sharpness in her eyes? Would he have an instinctive wariness of her? Not really, he replied finally. Brave boy, I said in some relief. Braver than me, anyway. His lack of fear reassured me in a roundabout way, allowing me to latch onto it and stay calm. With my guard down, I added a bit of a confession. I always thought her eyes were a bit scary. They seem like it, Todd replied. I would be scared too, if she looked at me like that. I didn't like the implications in those words. How does she look at you? I asked. He paused a moment before answering, as if confused by my question. She doesn't, he replied. She never looks at me. She only makes that sound, and she's always looking at you, as if cued by his words. I felt the pinprick awareness of eyes at the back of my head. I dared not look around. Maybe if you talked to her, she wouldn't be so angry, Todd signed. I leaned both elbows on the table, feeling suddenly heavy and lightheaded at the same time. Again, the helplessness. What on earth could I possibly say this time? To him? To her? I'm sorry you couldn't get away, but leave me alone? I thought again of Thimble. Todd was signing something else, but I didn't look up at him to read his words until I was ready to take in any more. He got impatient and tugged at my sleeve, but I was the one who spoke first. Do you ever see a cat around here? Todd frowned at me, as if I were making fun of him. Never mind, I said. I decided to not let the dead interfere too much with the living, no matter that some of us had eyes to see and most didn't. Just before Nan came home, I made Todd promise not to talk of Grandma Elizabeth again, and though he still had many questions about her, he didn't. The staring, however, was a habit I could never shake him out of. A few months later, I watched my little brother die. This would be the third time we would be waiting for death. It had been weeks of waiting before Grandma Elizabeth died, and days of waiting before Thimble died. But it had only taken hours for Todd, the one person of all I wanted to hold here longer. The infection he had narrowly survived had come back, and this time it wouldn't leave without him. His death is the blurriest in memory, though it was more recent, because this time I cared. Love is half blind, and the memory grows cloudier in time the more I obsess over it. I remember the hospital bed. I remember his ashen face, the shadows under his eyes. the antiseptic smell of death outside of home, the insulting cheerfulness of the cartoon animals on Band-Aids hiding his IV needles, disappearing into his skin. Our parents were out, getting coffee, making phone calls, waiting for my brothers to fly in, crying on shoulders. Hell is a waiting room, I remember thinking. I hadn't cried yet. We were alone in the room. I remember holding Todd's hand, watching his eyes flicker open at the very end. He looked at me, blankly, and then his eyes shifted over my shoulder. His eyes kept flitting between my face and over my shoulder. My hand tightened instinctively over his. "I won't let her hurt you," I found myself whispering for some reason. It was a promise I didn't know how to keep. His eyes kept flitting between my face and over my shoulder like thimbles had. I wanted to get up, scream at the air, tell her to leave us alone. But before I could, Todd raised his trembling hand. I thought to sign something to me and waved hello, but not at me. He had always been a polite child. I glanced over my shoulder and then back at him, a silent question on my face. He looked at me and signed. She's looking at me now. She had never done that before. I held his hand tighter, knowing he might be afraid. He signed, "It's okay." Then he lowered his hand and closed his eyes, too weak to continue. He died a few minutes later. I was the last one to see him alive. And this time, I did not run out with the news. Every day now, I see children dying, slowly or quickly. Sometimes expectedly, but always tragically. When at work at the children's hospital, at cancer wards and ICUs, I see Todd's face reflected back at me 100 times over, staring back placidly under the watch of crying strangers. Often it was only I and the dying child in the room who wouldn't be crying. My family couldn't understand how I could bear to do this sort of work, but I knew I had to. It wasn't because of how we had lost Todd, as they thought, but because I was starting to understand how to get rid of her. I knew her name and life, of course, but in my day-to-day life I often thought of her as something else. The angel of death, perhaps, and by extension and under her bidding, I was the angel of the deathbed. That's what some of the grateful parents called me. That was my job. I was called in to calm down frightened children and soothe their mental anguish. And nobody understood how I could, but I always did. The more sickly ones, the ones who had narrowly escaped death at infancy like Thimble and Todd had, often glanced over my shoulder, but said nothing. They always seemed to lose the fire to fight, to cry, to be alarmed at their own pain. Their souls grew old in my presence, awaiting death calmly, like one who had lived 5 times as long and 10 times as well. Their parents never understood, and neither did the doctors, but they were glad I was around, and I breathed not a word of her to anyone, sitting by the children's bedside toward the end of their short lives. I didn't even have to say a word. They only had to look at me, and then at the woman over my shoulder. When her eyes turned from me to them for the first and last time, the light would fade quietly out of their eyes. And I hoped the woman would come closer to being free herself, riding on the deaths of others until her own bonds were frayed, and she left me. To hurry things along, I would volunteer at the animal shelters after work every so often, helping to put down old dogs and ill cats. making sure their ends were peaceful. The dogs sometimes wagged their tails weakly when they looked over my shoulder, but more often they just stared, wary and resigned. The cats were more likely to act how Thimble did, the irritated flick of the tail, the twitch of the ears as they heard the noise in her throat. How many deaths she would need me to witness on her behalf is anyone's guess. Even outside of work, she drives me to somehow end up on the deathbeds of everyone I know. My parents, Nan, my oldest brother, when all those cigarettes had finally caught up to him, an aunt I was never close with. Somehow I would always be the last to see them alive, and it was all her doing. I don't think they ever saw her even before death. That was a privilege reserved for more innocent eyes, those who had always been closer to death than they were to life. And once they saw her, they couldn't leave without her permission. After Todd had died, I never spoke of Grandma Lisbeth again. There was no need to. She had done her part. She had taught my father that nobody should die alone. I learned that from him, and decided that as far as I could help it, they wouldn't. I still can't hear her, of course. Can't sense her there. So for the most part, I can try and continue like she isn't. I'm not always successful. Sometimes I find myself throwing salt over my shoulder and holding my breath. I have no idea whether that does anything. I stare into reflective surfaces at the emptiness over my shoulder, a compulsive habit, picturing what Todd had seen before he died. Every now and then, when I catch myself imagining I had done all that I could, I still find children, always children, glancing over my shoulder outside the hospital. Every now and then, animals would too. That's my only sign that she's still there, fading, wavering, but still trapped. Perhaps mine would be the last death she will need. Perhaps that's why she looked at me more than she looked at anyone else, as Todd gave me to believe, calling endlessly without words in her strangled, angry voice. These innocent, knowing, dying eyes are my only sign that I still have a long way to go, endlessly searching, with her eyes at the back of my head, for those about to cross over.
Some of the stories on my channel, when I read these specific stories that I find that are regional to where I am from in Virginia, it's kind of interesting. And there are places that I've been close to or through, so I'm kind of drawn to them. Specifically, stories that take place in the mountains of Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky. This next story takes place in West Virginia, right next door to me. And I grew up around the country culture of West Virginia. A lot of my ancestors are from there. Coal mining is a part of that culture, and the lifestyle that surrounds it has been thriving in those woods and hills of West Virginia for hundreds of years. A hardworking, tight-knit community are these folk, and I like stories that, whether they're crazy out there, unbelievable fiction or not, shines a light on them and their lives. This story is pretty cool. I like it a lot. It's probably my second favorite story, next to The Girl from Blackbird Creek. I hope you like it. It's called Hands of a Living God. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. The book of Mark, chapter 16, verse 17 and 18. It's kind of amazing that my grandma is still alive, just as sharp as she was in her younger years. Of course, being almost 90, she slowed down just a tad, but she's still just as fiery, and her memory hasn't lost its edge. She has a lot of stories in her, my granny, and every time she shares one with me, I make sure to pay close attention. It's not every day you get to listen to someone who's been through what she has. My family comes from West Virginia, generations of poor Appalachian miners and mountain folk who take pride in their history. Granny's no exception. She witnessed wars and a depression, not to mention burying both her husband and a son who died a few years ago. But she's a tough old bird, and I enjoy my visits to her house. I realize as I get older, she starts telling me stories I haven't heard before. I guess I'm old enough now to know about family secrets. Nothing too shocking. Just tales of Pap's days as a moonshiner, or about the baby she lost soon after the war. I like hearing these stories because it gives me a deeper understanding of my family. And I like hearing about what my mom was like as a rebellious teen in the 1950s. One story, though, was different. I don't even know what prompted her to tell me the tale, but it was a late evening in July when I heard it. It was such a warm night. I'd brought a watermelon over for the two of us to share after supper, and we sat there on the porch in the twilight, enjoying the sweet taste of melon and watching the fireflies begin to light up the pasture below. I was spitting the seeds over the porch, seeing how far I could shoot 'em, and Granny laughed that I was going to turn her flower garden into a watermelon patch come August. As we enjoyed the evening cool, Granny became thoughtful, retreating into her memories for a time. She did that now and again, and it never bothered me. Having lived a life as hers, I assumed she had a lot of memories to keep in line. Suddenly, she began to tell me a story from her past. A story that I'll keep with me until I pass away. Throughout the southern part of the state, scattered deep in the mountains, are the remains of old towns and vacant coal camps. You won't find them on the map, but if you know where to look and enjoy a good hike in the hills, you'll eventually stumble across one of these ghost towns. A few have already been demolished, and some have just collapsed over the years from weather and time, but a good number lay sleeping deep in the hills. A lot of these coal towns dried up after the closing of the local mine due to accident or economy, or when the ore veins puttered out. Since the mining company owned the property and all the buildings on said property, then there was no reason to keep a mine in operation in the area, and the whole town was shut down and abandoned. No coal, no business. It was pretty common in the old days, before the unions, and even afterwards it was still a possibility. Willow Fork was one such town, nestled deep in the southern hills with the company houses built in neat rows. Granny and Pap moved to the town soon after Pap came home from Germany and got a job in the mines. Pap came from a long line of coal miners. It was his life, and he was proud of the work and proud of the union. It was modest pay, what with a wife and 5 children to support, but he and the other men toiled under the mountains to mine the coal deep within. It was dangerous work, and the prospect of a cave-in or explosion was always present. Maybe that's why so many West Virginians are devout in their faith. Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostals. Each miner knew the sinner's prayer by heart. and every Sunday the churches were packed with mining families, giving thanks to the Lord that none of the men had died in an accident during the week. Religion was a big part of the community, and it seemed everyone in town was a member of some church and had a place for God in their lives. There was one church, though, that was a little different than the others. It was tucked away from Willow Fork, nestled in a holler to the north, not far from the yawning entrance of the mine. It was a small white wooden building with tiny windows, and painted on the pitched roof were the words, "Church of the Shepherd's Flock." The congregation was led by the Reverend Gerald Roberts, a fire and brimstone preacher who some believed was a prophet. He would claim that the Lord had spoken to him on such and such day, and talk of the rapture was always a topic he relished. While some people in the town believed him to speak the living word, others regarded the man with a mixture of contempt and fear. Along with claiming to be a prophet, the Reverend also encouraged his flock to take part in the handling of snakes. It's rooted in the belief that if one's faith is strong enough, then the Lord will protect the believer from the venom of snakes as well as that of poison, and also be able to heal the sick. The congregation gets whipped into frenzy, seized by the Holy Ghost, and begins to speak in tongues as the Spirit seizes them. Copperheads are brought out and held by members of the church, sometimes biting believers or remaining docile during the service. Other times, members of the church will drink poison like strychnine and remain unaffected afterwards. If someone does fall ill, the congregation will gather around and lay hands on the body as they attempt to heal the stricken. People have died for their faith by doing this, but still, the tradition continues even to this day. West Virginia is one of the few states where the practice of snake handling continues. Of course, not everyone in Willow Fork agreed with the practice. Some preached that it was an act of vanity and pride to try and tempt the Lord with such behavior. Others said that they were not seized by the Holy Spirit at all, but instead possessed by the devil himself, and that the Reverend was a false prophet. They that did belong to the Church of the Shepherd's Flock, however, truly believed in the words of Reverend Roberts and the power of the Spirit when they took serpents and poison. They were fanatical in their beliefs, zealots to their faith. In the summer of '49, life in Willow Fork seemed serene. My mother was a bored 13-year-old, and work in the mines was thriving, even if the pay was small. Granny and Pap worked hard to provide a safe home for their family, like everyone else in town, and despite being poor, things seemed okay. The only thing happening was Reverend Robert's tent revival in a few days. Tent revivals were always happening in the summer. It was perfect weather for the 3-day events, with all the food and singing and baptisms in the stream. Granny's church had just held theirs a few weeks ago up in Little Beaver, and a few new souls had been brought into the Lord. Maybe it was the preaching, or maybe it was the delicious fried chicken that won them over. People looked forward to revivals, but Church of the Shepherd's Flock was different. They held theirs in the clearing outside of the church, and on the way to the mines. Pap and the other men watched as the worn canvas tent was slowly raised in the dirt clearing by the road. Now, Pap was a tall, strong man of German stock and well respected in town. He had toured in Germany during the war and saw his share of fighting, so nothing in Willow Fork seemed to scare him in the slightest. However, on his way to work that morning, he spotted the Reverend, and something inside him shuddered. Reverend Robert's eyes were lit with a fiery glow, a crazed possession that Pap hadn't seen in any man before. Were he a Catholic, maybe he'd have crossed himself, but instead, he just looked away, continued to the mines with his lunch bucket and cap. There were other things to worry about besides a zealous preacher, like explosions and cave-ins. One man who worked with Pap was named Jake Whitaker. His wife was a member of Robert's church, but he didn't want anything to do with it. Speaking in tongues, laying of hands, that I understand, he would say. But snakes? The minute I see a rattler or a copperhead, I'm done. If holding snakes proves I'm a Christian, then I guess I'll take my chances. Ida was constantly on him to join her and the children at church, and would always worry over the status of his soul. She'd finally worn him down. He agreed to attend the revival. He wasn't looking forward to it, but Jake loved his wife, and if it made her happy and brought some peace to the house, then he supposed one night wouldn't kill him. The other miners chuckled and nodded. The nagging wife just wasn't worth it. Pap still felt something chewing at him after seeing Roberts that morning. He hadn't felt this kind of anxiety since the time he was in France during the war, when suddenly the line had shifted and he and his men had found themselves in enemy territory, and they had to hide in the cellar of a kind farmer. But leading up to that moment, Pap just knew something was in the air. Now, he felt that same way after hearing Jake talk about the revival, but he dismissed it and continued to work. Work ended and the men walked home down the wide road, thankful for another day done. Once again, Pap passed the dirty canvas tent, now upright and ready for the revival, and once again he felt that sense of creeping dread in the pit of his gut. Young men were carrying wooden snake cages into the tent, as well as mason jars filled with what looked like rusty water. He knew that sometimes strychnine was drank as a testament of faith, and wondered if that was what the jars contained. But strychnine was a white powder, the poison drink created when it was mixed into water. Did it turn the water such a hue of orange? Again, he felt that sense of dread, and he watched the setup continue. And then he suddenly locked eyes with the Reverend. Gerald Roberts' eyes burned with such zeal and fire as he locked onto the coal miner. Roberts was by no means a large man. In fact, he was easily dwarfed by Pap. But the power and energy that man exuded was enough to topple any seasoned GI. The preacher smiled, his white teeth glistening in the light. Pap was suddenly reminded of the flashing of bayonets. "Why don't you come and join us, Brother John?" he called out, "lest you ignore the voice calling in the wilderness." "That's quite all right." He fumbled over his words, feeling uneasy over the fact that Roberts had spoken his name. "I know where I stand with the Lord." He started to walk away, but the preacher called out to him once more. "It's a frightful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, John." That evening, Granny and the children were cleaning up after supper in the kitchen. Pap was listening to the radio. It was a wrestling match broadcasted out of Beckley. Pap loved wrestling. Usually he would get worked up over the match, yelling and hollering as the announcer detailed the chaos in the ring. But tonight he was still troubled by his meeting with Reverend Roberts and the strange liquid. Something wasn't right. He wasn't sure what it was he'd felt when he first laid eyes on the jars or the presence of the preacher. But slowly it dawned on him as the second match started. He felt like the hand of the devil had touched his soul. He shuddered and took a drink of his Dr. Pepper. And Granny knew something troubled her husband but didn't press. If he needed to tell her, he would. As she finished washing the last of the dishes, a blue Ford pickup erratically drove up to their front gate before parking. The driver's door opened and out fell Jake Whitaker, his white dress shirt and pants covered in blood. "John," he yelled, picking himself up and running to the door of the small company house. "John, come quick." Pap went to the door and opened it to see a panicked, blood-soaked Jake. "Jesus Christ, Jake. It's Ida. It's the damn preacher. They've all gone missing. You've got to come with me, John. Something evil has taken hold of everyone. My kids, John. She killed our kids." Pap grabbed the hunting rifle off the mantel and turned to his wife before heading out to the truck. Said, "Don't let the children out and don't come looking for me, okay?" And Granny yelled after him, "John, be careful." She felt the same dread her husband felt as she watched the blue truck speed off, followed by a number of other trucks. Jake must have alerted other men in the town before coming to their house, forming a posse to inspect the scene. She quickly shut the door and bolted it, telling the children to do the same with the back door as well as the windows. Whatever was out in the woods might be coming to the village. As Pap drove the truck, Jake rambled about the revival. It had started like any other. Prayers, gospel singing as the congregation felt the Holy Spirit take possession of them. Jake had sat near the back with his wife and his children, a son and daughter, as the rest of the congregation testified and sang. He felt out of place and a little uneasy, but his wife was so happy to have him there. Like a real family, she had said. Soon the Reverend entered and began his usual hellfire preaching, talking of the apocalypse and the wrath of the Lamb. He continued to speak of the visions he'd seen from the Lord and the message of destruction he was to spread. True faith had vanished, he proclaimed, and the lambs are easily pulled from the narrow path into the wilderness. Then the devil appeared to him, he claimed, and said if he really did love the Lord, then he would drink of this cup. Robert then gestured to the mason jars lined behind him. The devil himself had given him the poison, stronger than any made by the hands of man. But the power of the Lord is stronger, he cried. In the congregation, they praised the Lord, shouted amen, and erupted in their seats. Roberts took a jar and held it up before the people. He would show the devil just how unshakable his faith was, and if anyone wanted to join him in the act of pure faith, then they would join him. Jars were distributed out as gospel music started up from the choir again. Jake suddenly felt scared as he watched the Reverend take the first drink. Just what was that poison? His wife jumped up to take a drink, urging her husband to join, but he refused and stayed behind with the children. He should have stopped her. He knew something wasn't right, but he just couldn't do it. He watched as she and a good number of people drank the rusty liquid, gagging slightly as it went down. The singing intensified. People were now speaking in tongues and clapping to the music. Those that drank the poison were even more active, jumping up and down and praising the Lord with upraised arms. Reverend Roberts was shouting now, claiming how they had just defeated the devil and how Jesus would receive them in the end time. Everyone was cheering and singing praises, until one member of the congregation doubled over and vomited a stream of blood. Others began to follow suit, and for a moment there was wild panic. But the Reverend called out for order. There was no reason to be alarmed. It was just another test of the devils. Those not afflicted began to lay hands on the ill members and pray over their bodies. Jake quickly looked for Ida and spotted her as she slowly made her way towards him and the children. The front of her dress was soaked in blood and it dribbled out the side of her mouth, and the children screamed in terror as she approached them, her arms outstretched towards her husband. "Jake," she weakly called. Another gush of blood and black bile poured from her mouth as blood began to trickle from her nose and her ears. She fell to the ground, convulsing before his feet. All around them, a large number of people had done the same, and the tent walls were soon splattered with red and black. The Reverend had succumbed as well, retching and screaming in pain as a geyser of blood erupted from his mouth. Jake grabbed his wife, tried to rouse her. The children were weeping in fear and terror at the chaos around them. As Jake screamed Ida's name, her eyes snapped open, bloodshot, stared at him for a solid 5 seconds. A grin began to divide her scarlet-stained face, ruby teeth flashing. Her gaze jerked away from Jake and locked onto their 2 young, crying children. "Come to Mama," she wheezed. And suddenly, with a speed and a strength Jake had never seen before, Ida jumped up and fell upon the children. He watched, paralyzed with shock, as his wife began to tear apart their small bodies and ripped chunks of flesh and muscle with her teeth. Screams of terror and pain began to fill the tent as more blood-stained faithful began to pounce onto other parishioners. There was blood and bone and gore all over that tent, a sea of red collecting at their feet. Jake wasn't sure what happened next, but he said suddenly he was in his truck driving back into town, speeding and swerving like a madman. Pap's hands were white-knuckle as he listened to Jake's tale. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be true. When he and the other men reached the revival site, however, his guts were filled with icy fear. They walked towards the tent, rifles and guns ready, as the smell of blood filled their noses. The canvas fluttered in the rosy sunset, and the clearing was still. Slowly the men advanced to the site. Jake was muttering to himself, eyes wide in shock as he walked behind Pap towards the tent. He kept repeating to himself, "They're all dead, they're all dead, they're all dead." The lead man was a miner named Holt. He was the first to enter, signaling the rest to wait for his signal. He just said, "Lord, have mercy." "What is it, Holt?" one of the men yelled as he readied his rifle. Holt said nothing but motioned for the others. Pap hesitated before advancing. He didn't want to know what was waiting inside, what horror the tent had in store. He'd seen enough of that in Germany, left it all behind after crossing the Atlantic back to the U.S. Now it was coming back. The blood, the death, the dread. Pap found his feet moving forward despite his fear. Jake was weeping like a little child now. His pitiful sobs were the only sounds in the clearing, but as the group entered the tent, there were more sounds. Sounds of disgust. Sounds of terror. Pap ducked in through the canvas opening and stood beside Holt, surveying the scene. The first thing he noticed was the blood. It was everywhere. The walls, the wooden podium, all over the packed dirt floor. There were bodies, too. Mangled and partially devoured bodies, strung all over the tent like Christmas garland. The snake cages had been ripped open and the serpents nowhere to be found. A few of the miners became sick and quickly exited the tent, while the rest stood in silent shock. Pap knelt down and picked up an empty mason jar. There was a little rust-colored liquid left inside. He sniffed it and quickly jerked his head away. His eyes watered, and his vision blurred for a second. "What do you have, John?" one of the men asked. He handed him the jar. "Poison, probably what they drank, but I don't reckon it's strychnine." Jake screamed from outside the tent. "It was devil's blood. They drank the blood of Satan, and the Lord made him pay." The group looked at each other with unease. There was this thick fog of evil in the room, and every man felt a chill in his bones. Holt pointed to the other side of the tent. There was a large tear in the canvas and a trail of blood leading out of it. They followed the trail of blood for a few feet before realizing where it led, to the mine. As they neared the mouth of the mine, they saw them, those that drank the poison. Pap's eyes widened in horror as he watched the group slowly walk into the blackness. There were about 40 or so of them, pale as death and bathed in blood and other bodily fluids. And their eyes were gold and slit like a snake's, staring straight ahead as they walked. "They're going into the mine," one man yelled. "Sons of bitches," another one muttered. He leveled his rifle at one of the faithful. Before anyone could protest, he shot the man, blowing off the top part of his head. The man staggered back for a bit, before stumbling forward with the others. That shot should have killed the man. He should have fallen to the ground dead. But he didn't. He just kept walking forward. It was then, I think, that the group realized that perhaps Jake was right. What they were dealing with wasn't of this earth, but was pure evil. Pap was a God-fearing man, but he was also a rational man. Things happened for a reason, and there was a logical explanation for everything. Now he wasn't sure.
The only thing he could think of was the Bible's talk of the dead walking the earth once more, and the judgment of the living. Had Judgment Day come for them? As the men stood there in shocked silence, watching the parade of the bloody damned, Jake stood up and pointed down the road. "Ida!" he yelled in horror. The men followed his hand and saw the woman. She was the last of the group, shambling towards the mine entrance. She carried in her arms the bloody remains of what they assumed were her children. Her simple yellow dress was so soaked with blood that one would think it was red. Her blonde hair was matted with gore. Jake whimpered in terror as she passed the group, not paying the miners any heed. But as she walked, she suddenly stopped and slowly turned towards Pap and Jake, that same grin spreading across her red face. The men aimed their rifles at the woman and prepared to fire should she lunge toward them, but Ida remained still. After a few seconds, she spoke. Her voice was gravelly and low, but Pap heard her words clearly. "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God." She turned back towards the mine and walked into the darkness with the others. Jake screamed out loud, pulling at his hair and his clothes. The men tried to restrain him, but it was no use. He ran into the mine wailing after his wife and dead children. His voice slowly faded as he went deeper into the mine before dying out altogether. Holt decided it was best to seal the mine's entrance and bury the creatures within. Whatever evil the Reverend unleashed could not spread into the village. Not to mention no man in Willow Fork would dare step foot in the mine, knowing what now lurked within. A few of the men asked about Jake. Should they go and rescue him? Holt shook his head. Jake was probably dead, or perhaps one of them now. It was best to seal him inside. Pap numbly nodded in agreement and helped in wiring the explosives and quarter sticks around the mouth of the mine. They detonated the charges, and in a cloud of dust and rock the mine was sealed. The explosion echoed off the stoic green mountains, as if they too agreed with the decision. That evening, Pap came home but didn't say anything as Granny and the children asked about Jake and the explosion. He said nothing, but did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the cupboard. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey Granny kept for when she became ill, and sitting at the simple wooden table, Pap poured himself a drink and downed it in silence. Granny put the children to bed despite their protests and joined Pap in the kitchen. After a few more drinks, he told her that they were leaving tomorrow and moving to Farco, another coal camp to the east. He didn't explain why, but his words were final. In the morning, they weren't the only ones to be leaving Willow Fork, and by the end of the week, the entire town had been abandoned. It wouldn't be for many years until Pap told Granny about that day. It was shortly before he died, and maybe he was feeling guilty for letting his friend Jake Whitaker go into that mine, only to be sealed within. Granny sat in silence after finishing that story. The night was dark and the frogs were singing in the pond down in the pasture. The watermelon had long since been forgotten. I said nothing, but then the mountains looked more menacing in the blackness. Granny simply shook her head and sighed. I'm the only person she'd ever shared that story with, and I know she wouldn't make these things up. Of course, the mine is sealed, and Willow Fork isn't even on the map. Whatever still remains in that mine is trapped within and can't get us. We're safe in the hills. They keep our secrets and our sins. Only, lately, I've been watching the news, and I hear that they're looking to revive the mining industry in what was Willow Fork. I know it's still talk, but the demand for coal is high, and West Virginia will do anything to keep that industry alive. I wonder if they do reopen the mine, what they'll find in the old shafts. One can only keep a secret for so long.
And there you have it. The top 7 creepypastas for 2021 from bigdaddystone. Thank you for joining me for this review. I don't expect everyone to listen to it all the way through the first time because it's a little bit long. That's all right. You come back, you visit me again. I love having you come by, listen to my stories, hang out for a little bit. Check me out on Twitter. I don't tweet much, but if something comes along, I say something occasionally. This year, I would like to upload 100 videos rather than just 50. So that's my goal. Wish me luck. I want to give a special thank you to Romnex and the Dark Somnium. Without their help, encouragement, I would not be doing this right now. I would still be just consuming what they put out and other narrators instead of scratching that itch and just jumping in and doing something that's fun. So, Ronnie, Rom, I love you. Thank you so much for everything. And I can't wait to see you for the next video, which I'm going to try to put out something a little bit special for my birthday on February 3rd. Hopefully I'll see you there. Hit that like and subscribe button too. Please. And thank you. Bye-bye.